Hey guys, tonight we step together into a world of sharp winds and frost-bitten mornings, where you walk across a deck so cold it feels like it's trying to climb straight into your bones, and as you breathe out, you watch your breath curl into the air like a tiny ghost that immediately regrets being outside, and before you get too comfortable, imagining you could actually survive what comes next, here's the gentle reminder that you probably won't survive this if you ever tried it for real. Because the sea is patient, the cold is patient, and your modern indoor heated sensibilities are absolutely not prepared for this level of disrespect from the weather. But anyway, we're here, we're shivering together, and we're telling the story. So let's pretend you've got what it takes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'm really curious, from which part of the world are you watching this video? Let me know your location and local time down in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand on the docks before sunrise, surrounded by fishermen who move with that half-awake confidence of people who've done the same brutal routine thousands of times. Their boots thudding on frozen planks with a steady rhythm that keeps the quiet morning from collapsing into silence, and the world around you is painted in that soft blue that happens right before dawn, the kind that feels too delicate to belong to a place as harsh as the winter sea. You hear gulls calling from somewhere overhead, their voices slicing through the cold, and your fingers twitch because the air is so bitter it makes your knuckles feel like stiff pebbles in your hands. The older fishermen, the ones with hands like driftwood and eyes like they haven't blinked since 1974, watch you carefully, not out of suspicion, but out of that subtle amusement that comes from seeing someone new pretend they understand what they've signed up for. One of them gives you a nod, the universal maritime gesture for you'll either be fine or you'll be a cautionary tale by lunch, and you nod back, because refusing a nod from a seasoned fisherman is the kind of thing superstitions are born from. As you step onto the deck, the wood gives beneath your boots with a groan that sounds like the ship is waking up, stretching its stiff limbs and reminding every soul aboard that it is the one in charge. The planks are slick with a thin sheen of frozen spray, the kind that can send you flying if you misjudge even a single step, and you instinctively reach for a rope to steady yourself, only to discover that the rope feels like a frozen serpent, stiff and uncooperative, crackling faintly as the fibers protest the cold. The air smells like salt, fish, and the faint sweetness of last night's lantern oil still clinging to the crew's coats, a scent that somehow manages to be comforting despite the fact that nothing about your situation should be comforting. Your breath fogs as you inhale deeply, and the cold rushes into your lungs with that sharp metallic taste that tells you exactly how unforgiving the open sea is going to be. You watch the crew preparing the boat with quick, practiced motions, checking knots, securing crates, tapping the hull in familiar places to listen for unhealthy echoes. One man carries a bucket of what looks like murky brown sludge and smears it along part of the railing. You assume it's some kind of protective sealant, only for another fisherman to chuckle and explain that it's whale oil mixed with ashes, a centuries-old trick used to keep ice from building too quickly on the rails. And here's your quirky tidbit for the night. Some 18th century fishermen genuinely believed rubbing a bit of herring juice on gloves made fingers less offended by winter's mood, though modern scholars mostly call that a creative misinterpretation of desperation. You glance toward the harbor's mouth where the dark silhouette of the sea waits like a creature just barely patient enough to let you approach, and as you watch a faint shimmer of pink begin to touch the horizon, you feel the familiar mixture of fear and adrenaline that the fishermen around you seem to carry like an extra layer of clothing. The boat creaks as more crew members climb aboard, each of them wrapped in so many layers of wool and oilskin that they look like soft, lumpy bears who've decided to try blue-collar work. Someone stomps past you carrying a kettle that rattles with leftover stew, muttering about heating it up once they get far enough out that the wind becomes respectfully vicious instead of rudely murderous, and that phrasing alone tells you exactly what kind of day you're about to have. The captain appears next, his beard frosted before he even finishes fastening his coat, and he gives a half-hearted wave toward the rising sun, as if greeting an old friend he doesn't particularly like but must acknowledge, because they work the same shift. He barks a series of orders that somehow manage to sound both tired and authoritative, and the crew jumps to respond. Nets are checked, knots retied, and a wooden crate full of hand-carved floats is kicked open with the casual respect given only to things that could save your life if handled correctly, or doom you if neglected. Someone hands you a cup of steaming liquid, and you take a cautious sip only to discover it tastes like burnt seaweed boiled in regret. But the heat it brings to your chest is welcome, so you pretend it's delicious. The fisherman beside you chuckles, telling you that the recipe supposedly dates back to medieval Nordic crews who believed the drink kept the frost demons away, though historians still argue whether frost demons were literal folklore or simply metaphorical grumbles about hypothermia, a debate that continues, because scholars love to overcomplicate things. The boat shudders as the engine grumbles to life, its low rumble vibrating through the entire vessel like a whale clearing its throat, and you grip the railing to steady yourself. The captain calls for cast-off, and ropes are loosened from the harbor posts with the efficiency of men who could probably do this in their sleep, and some of them probably have. The boat drifts forward, slow at first, then gathering confidence as it pushes into deeper water, leaving behind the safety of the harbor lights. You turn back once to watch the shoreline retreat, the tiny lamps glowing weakly in the dim dawn like tired eyes watching you go, and there's something strangely comforting about seeing them shrink, as if the world behind you gently acknowledges your willingness to face what lies ahead. As the boat glides into the open sea, the air grows colder, sharper, almost glass-like in its intensity, and you pull your layers tighter, grateful for the wool scratchiness that now feels like a warm embrace from a grumpy grandparent. Frost begins forming on the outer edges of the nets, delicate at first like lace, then thickening quickly as the sea breeze weaves ice through the fibers. You notice how the crew moves differently now, slower, more deliberate, conserving energy, saving warmth, using their bodies as tools shaped by habit and necessity. Every motion has purpose, every step is measured, every breath is taken like a small negotiation with the cold. You understand, without anyone needing to say it, that pace matters more than strength here. The horizon lightens, revealing a band of pale gold stretching across the water, and you watch the waves shift from shadowy blue to shimmering silver, as if the sea is pulling on its morning coat. The boat rises and falls gently, each swell lifting you like a slow exhale. For a moment, there is peace. Cold, biting peace, but peace nonetheless. Then a gust of wind slams into you with the force of an irritated troll, nearly knocking you sideways, and the nearest fisherman grabs your coat, yanking you upright with the casual reflex of someone who has prevented hundreds of beginners from involuntarily going for a winter swim. First rule, he mutters without looking directly at you, don't trust the sea. It's friendly until it's not. His words hang in the air, half warning, half tradition, and you tuck them into your mind alongside all the other half superstitions you've accumulated tonight. The crew starts preparing the lines, each person working silently now as though speech might shatter the fragile concentration forming around them. You watch how they test knots with a single tug, how they tighten their gloves, how they shift their stance so their weight is perfectly balanced when the next wave hits. They are preparing for cold, not just as a temperature, but as an adversary. The boat pushes farther from shore, into the kind of icy openness that makes your stomach drop, the kind where the horizon blends into the clouds until you can't tell where the sky ends and the sea begins. The cold deepens, wrapping itself around your face like an uninvited scarf made of tiny knives, and your fingertips, despite being wrapped in layers, begin to throb in protest. The captain steps beside you, pointing toward the pale morning light spreading across the sky, and says calmly, "This is the warmest you'll be today," which is absolutely the most discouraging pep talk you've ever received, but you nod anyway, like this is fine, and everything is perfectly normal. A faint rime of frost begins to cling to the tips of your eyelashes, coating them in tiny crystals that sparkle briefly before melting from the heat of your blink, and you realize the cold is not a single sensation but a series of stages that slowly negotiate with your dignity. The deck beneath your boots crunches now, as fresh ice forms with every splash of seawater that leaps across the bow, and the boat moves with a slow determination that feels almost alive. The crew's energy shifts again as the last glow of dawn finally breaks, revealing the vast expanse of steel-colored waves stretching endlessly in every direction. And here, standing on this tiny wooden fortress surrounded by frozen nothingness, you finally understand why surviving the cold isn't about toughness alone. It's about rhythm, ritual, and the quiet defiance of people who have learned to outstubborn nature itself. You take one more breath, your lungs burning slightly as icy air pours in, and you steady yourself for whatever comes next, carrying with you the warmth of the harbor lights, the scratch of wool against your skin, and the knowledge that this day, like every day at sea, will ask you to earn your survival moment by moment, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat. You stand at the center of the deck as the morning grows brighter. Though brighter is a generous word, because the sun out here feels more like a reluctant flashlight rather than an actual star. And every breath you take curls into a tiny frost cloud that immediately regrets its life choices. And the fishermen around you begin slipping into the full ritual of dressing for the cold, layering themselves in wool, oilskins, sea-stiffened coats, and bundles of fabric so thick they look like exhausted winter onions, and you, trying to imitate them, fumble with your own layers in a way that makes one fisherman laugh softly before stepping over to help you, because watching you put on your gear is like watching a lamb try to knit itself, and you take the insult gracefully because he's right, and also because this whole situation would have gone worse if he hadn't intervened. You notice how the wool they wear isn't the soft, cozy stuff you find in modern stores. No, this is the coarse, rugged, slightly itchy wool that medieval shepherds would have approved of, the kind spun dense enough to trap heat even when drenched, which is perfect, because you will get drenched whether you want to or not. One of the older men, hands shaking only because the cold demands it, explains that wool insulates even when wet due to the crimp in its fibers, which creates tiny heat-trapping pockets, and you nod like you understood that without Googling it, feeling slightly proud when he adds that this is one reason wool clothing dominated coastal life for centuries, mainstream historical fact achieved, and yes, you mentally check the box with satisfaction. Then comes the oilskin layer, a stiff, weather-hardened coat, smelling faintly of cod liver oil and campfire smoke. And the texture is somewhere between leather jacket and old sail that survived emotional trauma. And as you slip into it, you feel instantly heavier, but also instantly more protected, like you're now half human and half rainproof barrel. The fishermen treat their oilskins with a reverence normally reserved for family heirlooms or beloved pets, rubbing them down regularly with mixtures of linseed oil, fish oil, and beeswax to keep them waterproof. And one fisherman tells you that his grandfather swore oilskins worked best when seasoned with seawater, prompting a younger crew member to roll his eyes and whisper that the old man also believed the moon controlled hair growth, which you personally think might still be true depending on your shampoo. The notion of seawater seasoned oilskins becomes your quirky tidbit, and you cherish it because it fits perfectly beside last section's herring juice finger myth, reminding you that human beings will believe anything if they're cold enough and bored enough. You look around and notice how every fisherman's outfit is slightly different, stitched patches here, leather straps there, mismatched buttons replaced by carved bits of driftwood, and yet each one follows the same formula: wool to trap heat, oilskin to block wind, something waterproof to guard against waves, and something sentimental sewn into the lining to remind them of home. One man has a tiny cloth charm stitched into the inside of his sleeve, and when you ask about it he shrugs and says it's just a bit of fabric from his daughter's old blanket. For luck, not superstition. And you don't argue because out here the line between luck and superstition feels as thin as the ice forming on your eyelashes. As the crew continues preparing, you notice how they all adjust their layers in specific ways, tightening sleeves to prevent icy water from trickling down their arms, tucking scarves beneath coat collars so the wind doesn't slice at their throats, wrapping wool around wrists to insulate the pulse points, and suddenly you realize dressing for the cold isn't a chore but a tactical operation, and you are the least experienced soldier in this very chilly army. The cold deepens as a breeze skims across the deck, slipping beneath your layers like a nosy ghost checking your spine for warmth, and you instinctively hunch your shoulders, only for the captain to tap your arm and tell you calmly, "Don't curl inward. If you curl, you trap the cold. Stand straight. Let your layers do the work," and you uncurl in the stiff, awkward way of someone learning to walk again, and he nods in approval when the wind passes over you more cleanly. The boat creaks and shifts as the first real wave breaks against the hull, sending a spray of icy droplets into the air, and some of those droplets land on your oilskin coat and bead up beautifully like tiny pearls before sliding off, and you marvel at the simplicity of a waterproofing technique that has survived since the days when sailors thought sea monsters stole socks. A fisherman beside you explains how, in older centuries, crews mixed soot into their oilskin treatments, believing dark colors absorbed more warmth, and while modern science doesn't fully endorse this on winter seas, it nonetheless fueled a centuries-long tradition of black, brown, and deep moss-green coats dominating northern fisheries. As he speaks, he pats your shoulder in the oddly gentle way of a man who simultaneously respects you for trying and assumes you might die at any moment. You look down at your gloves, thick woolen, reinforced with leather along the palms, and notice that despite the layers, your fingertips already sting with the beginning stages of cold ache, that slow, creeping numbness that feels suspiciously like nature trying to erase individual fingers from your personal inventory. One of the younger fishermen, noticing your discomfort, hands you a small lump of animal fat wrapped in cloth and instructs you to rub it into your gloves for warmth retention. You obey, surprised at how quickly the sensation of heat begins returning to your fingertips, and he grins proudly as if he's just taught you forbidden magic, which in a way he has. And as you work the fat into the fabric, he casually mentions that some fishermen used to warm their hands by stuffing their gloves under their armpits between tasks, leading to centuries-old drawings of sailors that look suspiciously like they're trying to hug themselves aggressively. You continue adjusting your layers when a fisherman points out something strange: icicles forming on the tips of the masts despite the rising sun. He gestures upward with a quiet hum of concern, noting that while this is normal, it's happening earlier than expected, which means the day ahead will be harsher than usual. The wind shifts again, bringing with it a slicing scent of iron and deep-sea minerals, and you draw your coat tighter, grateful for every fiber clinging to your body. The crew begins applying oil to ropes to keep them flexible in the cold, and you watch in awe as they work like a single organism, motion after motion, knot after knot, each action shaped by instincts passed down across generations. The captain explains that fishermen historically relied on this kind of shared knowledge long before written manuals existed, passing survival techniques orally through families and villages, though scholars today still argue whether certain traditions emerged independently or spread via trade routes. Your open scholarly debate phrase neatly tucked into the narrative like a bookmark for academic readers. You catch a fragment of conversation between two crew members discussing which parts of their outfits stay warmest. One swears by double-layered wool trousers, while another insists nothing beats the old sheepskin folded over the chest method, which to you sounds like the world's least fashionable winter accessory. One fisherman reveals he lined his boots with dried seaweed for insulation, claiming it keeps heat better than any modern padding, and while you're doubtful, his feet look warmer than yours, which is frankly insultingly unfair. The boat hits a larger swell, rocking sharply, and you steady yourself using a rope coated in oil and seawater, grateful again for the layers protecting your skin from the sting of the cold. The railing is slick beneath your gloves, frost creeping across the wood like delicate white roots, and you marvel at how the fishermen move across this treacherous surface without hesitation. Their layers don't hinder them. Instead, the clothing seems to shape the way they move. Broad stances, careful steps, controlled breathing. One of the crew begins telling a story, half warning, half entertainment, about a fisherman who once tried to wear cotton on a winter voyage, only to discover that cotton absorbs and holds water like a vengeful sponge, turning itself into a portable block of frozen misery. Everyone listening nods vigorously, adding their own muttered indictments of cotton as though it were a treacherous ex-friend, and you silently vow never to wear it again anywhere north of Spain. Another mentions that wool's lanolin, the natural oil present in sheep fleece, helps repel water, which is why untreated wool is especially valuable at sea. He tugs on his sleeve proudly, as if showing off a pet with excellent manners, and you can't help admiring the practicality of a material that smells vaguely like a barn, but works like a high-end thermal system. The cold deepens as the boat pushes farther into open waters, the wind sharpening until it feels like it's slicing across your cheeks with tiny invisible blades. You bury your face deeper into your scarf and notice how the fishermen have wrapped theirs in strategic ways, some crisscrossing the fabric behind the neck, others looping it once, then tucking the ends inside their coats to prevent them from whipping wildly in the gale. A fisherman taps your elbow and adjusts your scarf for you, muttering that your previous method invited frostbite to tea, and while you didn't love that phrasing, you appreciate surviving more than you appreciate personal pride. As the hours stretch, your layers settle into place, warming with your body heat, and forming that fragile barrier between you and the endless cold. You begin noticing how different parts of the clothing respond to movement. The wool flexes gently, the oilskin stiffens against the wind, the scarves trap warmth along your neck like a protective moat, and the boots creak with each shift of your weight. The cold still tries to seep in, but the layers fight back. Somewhere in the back of your mind you remember the fisherman's warning from earlier. Stand straight. Let the layers work for you. You breathe deeply, your scarf frosting slightly with each exhale, and you begin to feel the strange sensation of warmth blooming beneath all the fabric, as if your body is slowly learning how to survive out here. You watch the fishermen settle into their tasks with that same calm determination, their layers bending, creaking, and shifting with every movement, turning each man into a mobile fortress against the sea. You take one last look at the horizon, a hard gray blue stretching endlessly ahead, and realize that everything you wear, every piece of wool, every smear of oil, every thread woven by hands that understood the cold, stands between you and the deep freeze waiting patiently around you, and as the wind rises once more, you brace yourself, knowing this clothing is more than fabric. It is inherited knowledge, survival stitched into every fiber, a quiet defiance against a winter sea that never tires of testing human resolve. You brace yourself against the railing as the cold deepens, and the fishermen begin their next quiet ritual, the one that always feels slightly illegal, because you are about to watch people create fire on a wooden boat surrounded by water, colder than your ex's emotional availability, and as you shuffle closer, your boots sliding on the frost-hardened deck, you notice the men gathering around a squat metal box that looks like it was welded together by someone who truly believed instructions were only suggestions, and this strange contraption immediately begins radiating a faint heat that feels wildly suspicious in an environment where everything else is freezing. The box is called a bogey stove, a portable metal heater that fishermen have used for centuries, and as soon as a few glowing embers dance inside it, the air around you warms just enough for your eyelashes to stop threatening to freeze shut. And this sudden change feels like magic, even though it's just very controlled combustion happening in a place where combustion usually isn't welcome. The crew feeds bits of charcoal and driftwood into the stove with long-handled tools, their faces glowing with orange highlights as the fire crackles like it's trying to apologize for the cold everywhere else, and you find yourself leaning in instinctively, letting the warmth kiss your knuckles through your gloves. One of the older fishermen clears his throat and explains, with the solemn authority of a man who has yelled at the ocean for decades, that boats historically used these metal stoves despite the obvious risks because the alternative was simply freezing. And he reminds you that mainstream historical fact, medieval and early modern fishing vessels often carried small iron fireboxes so crews could heat stews, thaw their hands, and keep morale from collapsing into frozen despair. You nod, pretending you don't feel deeply unsettled by how casual they are about open flames near ropes, nets, tarred wood, and every other thing on this ship that looks flammable enough to burst into flames just from a dirty look. The heat spreading from the stove feels incredible, but every crackle makes you flinch, as if the fire might suddenly decide the whole boat is a snack. And one fisherman notices your tension and chuckles, patting the metal box with the reckless affection of a man who has clearly never feared anything in his life except maybe spilled stew. Another crew member demonstrates how they boil water on top of this stove, placing a blackened kettle that looks like it has been rescued from a volcano, and within minutes steam rises from the spout, curling into the icy air like a tiny dragon practicing deep breathing exercises. The fisherman lifts the kettle with thick gloves and pours the hot water into a wooden bucket, then dips cloths into it, before tossing the steaming rags at various crew members who catch them mid-air and slap them onto their chests, shoulders, and faces. This is apparently normal. Heated cloths used as mobile pockets of warmth. You quickly learn this technique has been around since boats were boats, as one man puts it, though historians still argue whether certain warm-up methods originated in Northern Europe or developed independently among fishermen worldwide. An open scholarly debate phrase slipped into the air as smoothly as fog rolling over the deck. You inch even closer to the stove, hands instinctively reaching toward the warmth, and one fisherman smirks knowingly, saying, "Careful, if you get too close, you'll smell like smoked cod for a week." And honestly, at this point you'd accept the trade, because your fingers feel like slightly offended icicles. Another man stirs a pot of stew perched precariously on the upper shelf of the stove, and when he lifts the lid, a cloud of fragrant steam bursts out, carrying the smell of fish, potatoes, herbs, and something else you can't quite identify. Possibly courage, possibly despair, possibly a vegetable that gave up halfway through life. The crew gathers around with bowls, slurping the stew in loud, satisfied gulps, and you realize that food isn't just nourishment here, it's warmth made edible. As the heat spreads across the deck, you start noticing other homemade heating devices. One fisherman pulls out a tiny tin filled with smoldering moss. Yes, moss, and explains that dried moss, once lit, burns slowly and creates hand-warming embers. This becomes your quirky tidbit. Some crews historically used smoldering moss as pocket warmers, storing the tins inside coat linings to radiate gentle heat throughout the day. You watch him slip the moss tin into an inner pocket like a secret treasure, and the steam rising from his collar proves it's working. Another fisherman demonstrates how they safeguard the fire from rogue waves by building a windbreak around the stove, wooden planks lashed together with ropes, forming a protective fortress that looks like a tiny castle built for a very ambitious squirrel. As the wind howls across the deck, the makeshift shield holds and the fire keeps burning steadily, defying the sea's best attempt at extinguishing it. You marvel at the absurd practicality of all this fire, water and ice coexisting in a delicate truce that somehow keeps everyone alive. But the stove isn't the only heat source aboard. A younger fisherman walks up holding a strange contraption that resembles a metal lantern filled with glowing rocks. He explains it's a stone warmer. Flat stones heated inside the stove until they're blazing hot, then transferred into portable cages to warm bunks, boots, and occasionally stubborn fingers. You watch him place one of these near a coil of rope, thawing it just enough to keep it flexible, and it hits you again just how many layers of survival exist here. Clothing, stoves, stones, heated cloths, steaming food, and the unwavering determination of people so used to hardship that comfort feels like a rumor. The boat sways gently, and a sudden blast of icy spray hits your face like a rude handshake from the sea, instantly undoing half the warmth you just absorbed. You shake your head, droplets freezing in your hair, and the nearest fisherman laughs, tossing you one of the heated cloths. You press it to your face, grateful for the instant thaw, while he tells you that life on a winter sea is a constant negotiation between freezing and toasting, and you believe him completely. As the fire continues crackling, the captain steps near and adjusts the stove's vent flap with deliberate precision. He explains how too much oxygen makes the flames wild, too little makes them die, and the balance has to be perfect, so the fishing lines, stacked nets, and oily wooden planks don't become an accidental bonfire. He speaks calmly about past captains who mastered this balance, mentioning one legendary skipper who supposedly kept a stove burning through a storm so brutal that the waves lifted the boat 30 feet at a time. Whether this story is true or the result of fishermen competing over who suffered the most is unclear, but it adds another layer to the mythology of sea survival, the way hardship gets sanded and polished until it becomes folklore. Then, with perfect timing, a fisherman sitting closest to the stove casually mentions he once saw someone boil tea in a seashell when the kettle broke, and you almost spit out your breath because the mental image of a grown man crouched over a fire, sipping shell tea like an elegant mermaid, overwhelms you with the charm of human improvisation. He shrugs and says, "Tea is tea," and you find yourself agreeing because at sea the rules of normal life seem to evaporate into the cold air. The warmth from the stove slowly crawls into your bones, thawing your stiff shoulders and making your fingers feel like they belong to you again. You start to understand why crews treat these stoves like sacred objects, not because they're magical, but because they give the one thing that cold winter seas always try to take first: hope. Warmth becomes a currency out here, traded in laughs, shared bowls of stew, passed cloths, glowing stones, and the occasional moss tin slipped into a pocket. You begin to appreciate the strange intimacy of communal warmth, the way everyone moves a little closer, stands a little straighter, breathes a little easier. But just as you're sinking into that fragile comfort, the boat tilts sharply as a powerful wave slams the hull, water surging across the deck in a silver sheet. The firebox rattles violently, and your heart leaps into your throat. But two fishermen leap forward at the same time, gripping the handles and steadying it with casual expertise. The fire flickers, sputters, then steadies again, glowing defiantly. The captain gives a small approving nod, as if the sea just attempted a theft and failed. The cold wind rises once more, bringing with it the taste of salt, iron, and distant storms. But for now, the deck feels like the warmest place on the planet, a temporary oasis floating in a frozen desert. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the heat seep into your skin, feeling the boat breathe beneath your feet, and remembering the older fisherman's earlier advice about standing straight, letting your layers and your tools do the work. You inhale slowly, the scent of smoke, stew, and seawater blending into something strangely comforting, and you realize that survival here isn't just about clothing or strength or luck. It's about this fire that shouldn't exist on a boat yet does, stubbornly, fiercely, and beautifully, keeping everyone alive one ember at a time. You steady yourself against a crate as the stove's warmth fades just enough to remind you that the cold out here never lets you forget who's in charge. And the fishermen begin preparing what they affectionately call heat you can chew, which sounds comforting until you realize it means food that exists less for taste and more for brute thermal force. And as pots and ladles clatter around you with the enthusiasm of an orchestra made entirely of hungry raccoons, you watch the crew fall into their midday ritual of cooking stews, broths, and mysterious ladle-borne substances that steam aggressively in the icy air, turning the deck into a foggy kitchen run by men who haven't trusted cookbooks since the dawn of civilization. One fisherman sets a heavy iron pot over the stove, muttering that the sea steals warmth faster than soup can make it, and you nod, grateful for any edible thing that promises to warm you from the inside out. The stew simmering inside the pot smells like a strange blend of fish, onions, potatoes, and possibly something that used to have feathers, though you're not entirely sure, because the ingredients are mostly described by vague gestures and shrug-based explanations, and as steam curls upward, you understand that this is not gourmet cuisine. it's survival in liquid form. When a fisherman lifts the lid, the steam hits your face with such glorious warmth that you briefly consider sticking your entire head inside the pot, but you restrain yourself because you'd prefer not to be the reason someone tells a cautionary tale later. The stew bubbles violently, tiny fat droplets dancing on top like they're performing for their lives, and one of the crew pours in a handful of herbs from a cloth pouch, explaining that fishermen have flavored broths with whatever they could gather from coastal markets for centuries. Mainstream historical fact, dropping neatly into your freezing brain like a warm stone, and you appreciate how history can occasionally taste like garlic and optimism. As the stew cooks, a younger fisherman starts telling you about another cold-fighting dish, a thick, salted fish broth they call sea tea, which is apparently a mixture of dried cod, water, and enough salt to dehydrate an elephant, boiled down until it becomes a thick, drinkable sludge that tastes like a dare, and he hands you a tin cup full of the steaming liquid as if he's offering you a priceless treasure. The taste is intense, so salty your taste buds write angry letters of protest, but the heat that surges down your throat feels incredible, like your organs are briefly grateful to still be inside your body, and you take another sip because comfort beats flavor in this environment 10 times out of 10. Another fisherman hands you a chunk of something wrapped in cloth, and when you unwrap it, you find a lump of hardtack soaked in hot broth, the texture somewhere between warm brick and resilient toast, and as you chew it slowly, you understand why people historically depended on these calorie-dense rations to survive long voyages. Someone behind you jokes that hardtack was invented by a man who hated teeth, and judging by how enthusiastically your molars are suffering, you suspect he might be right. As you rotate your cup between your hands like a miniature heater, the older fishermen begin discussing the importance of eating constantly to maintain body temperature, explaining that on winter seas, food is warmth. Warmth is survival, and survival is just another word for eating stew every 2 hours. And honestly, that sounds like a lifestyle you could get behind if the stew didn't taste like boiled ocean. You watch as the captain takes his portion, thick, dark, and steaming, and sits near the rail, staring out at the horizon while eating with slow, deliberate bites, the kind of rhythm that tells you this ritual is as ingrained in his bones as tying knots or reading the weather. The cold wind rises again, slicing through the air with renewed enthusiasm, but the warmth radiating from your stomach gives you a small protective shield, like you've swallowed a tiny campfire that flickers bravely inside you. Then comes the quirky tidbit. A fisherman casually mentions that some old crews believed warming food worked better if eaten from bowls carved specifically from driftwood found during storms, because stormwood holds fire in its memory, and while you're 99% sure that makes no scientific sense, you admire the poetic charm of men who can look at a piece of wood and decide it has emotions. Another man adds that his grandfather swore by rubbing a clove of garlic across the inside of a wooden bowl before pouring in stew, claiming it kept evil chills away, and you tuck that fact somewhere between interesting folklore and something I will absolutely try at home, even if it does nothing. As the sea grows rougher, the crew braces themselves and continues eating, standing up, bowls tucked into gloved hands, spoons rattling with each wave. You attempt the same stance but nearly lose your balance when the boat tilts unexpectedly, the stew sloshing dangerously close to the edge of your bowl, and a fisherman catches your elbow just in time, muttering, "Eat wide-legged," like the ocean owes you money, and somehow the advice works. You stabilize, widen your stance, and keep chewing while the world rocks beneath you, feeling a little more like you belong among these cold-weather veterans. One fisherman begins telling you about how past generations carried small pouches of dried fish flakes that could be turned into instant broth just by adding hot water, a practice recorded in several maritime logs, though scholars still argue whether these preserved fish flakes originated with northern fleets or whether similar methods developed independently across multiple fishing cultures. Your required open scholarly debate phrase, sliding naturally into the rhythm of his storytelling. Another fisherman shows you a leather pouch filled with dried seaweed strips, which he chews occasionally for energy, claiming they warm the belly fast, and while you're skeptical, the man seems healthier than anyone has the right to be in this temperature. So you refrain from questioning his kelp-based lifestyle. As you finish your bowl, warmth spreads across your chest, stomach, and arms, a slow-burning heat that feels far more powerful than the firebox alone. Your fingers loosen, your shoulders relax slightly, and your breath no longer fogs quite so aggressively, as though your body has finally remembered how to be a functional heat-producing organism. You glance around and notice the same transformation happening in the rest of the crew. Faces softening, shoulders dropping, eyes sharpening with renewed focus. The boat remains an unpredictable beast beneath your feet, but the men seem steadier now, as if every spoonful of stew reinforces their connection to the work ahead. Someone hands you a second serving, insisting that the sea will steal the first one right out of you, and you're not sure if he means calorically or spiritually, but you take the bowl anyway and start eating again, because saying no to warmth feels like a crime. The taste begins to grow on you, slowly, like an acquired appreciation for cold showers or existential dread, and you start noticing pleasant undertones beneath the salt, the softness of potatoes, the richness of fat, the comfort of hot broth soaking into your throat like a promise of temporary safety. A fisherman at your side dips his stew spoon into the pot, then taps the ladle against the rim in a little rhythm, a kind of culinary Morse code, and you hear someone across the deck tap back with their own spoon. It takes you a moment to realize you're witnessing the ship's version of small talk, not words, but spoon taps, steam sharing, and the communal comfort of warm food eaten in freezing air. Out here, language shifts into gestures, shared bowls, passed cups, and mutually acknowledged hunger, and you find it strangely beautiful how warmth becomes a conversation all its own. The wind rises again, and a new wave of icy spray whips across the deck, stinging your face and sinking through your layers like a rude reminder that comfort is temporary. Instantly, several fishermen lift their bowls protectively, shielding their warm food from the splash as though guarding precious treasure, and you do the same, instinctively cradling your bowl like it contains the last bit of warmth on earth. When the wave passes, laughter ripples across the deck, soft, breathy, a little exhausted, and for a moment the cold feels less intimidating, softened by shared absurdity. As you take your final spoonful, heat radiates from your core in waves, pushing back the icy grip that surrounds everything else. You feel steadier, more present, more aware of the warmth inside you that refuses to surrender. The fishermen finish their bowls, wipe them clean with bits of hardtack, and return to their tasks with renewed energy, moving with that quiet determination that only truly warm humans can muster. You set your empty bowl aside, flex your fingers inside your gloves, and inhale deeply, preparing yourself for whatever the sea throws at you next, carrying the fading but still powerful warmth of stew, sea tea, and shared survival deep in your chest as the boat creaks softly beneath your feet, waiting for its next challenge. You grip a rope that feels like a frozen snake as the next wave slams across the deck, sending a shimmering sheet of seawater skidding toward your boots with the cold-hearted enthusiasm of something that wants to ruin your entire week. And you quickly learn that staying dry on a winter sea is not just a preference, it is a sacred mission, a full-time occupation, a kind of ongoing duel between humans and moisture, and the ocean is undefeated in the long-term standings. So every fisherman around you treats dryness as both strategy and prayer. You watch as the crew shifts into a practiced formation, moving across the deck with the cautious speed of people who have learned to calculate the exact angle at which water travels when thrown by a wave, dodging sprays and sidestepping puddles with a level of intuition that borders on supernatural. One fisherman shouts for you to lift your feet as a pool of icy salt water gathers near your ankles, and you hop clumsily, nearly slipping, earning yourself a sympathetic but mildly amused nod from the crew member, who clearly remembers his own first day of dodging ocean slap attacks. The wind sharpens, slicing through the air with a chilling hiss, and a misty fog rises from the waves, creeping across the deck like cold fingers, seeking an open seam in your clothing, and you clamp your coat tighter, praying your oilskin holds. One of the fishermen taps the side of your arm and points to the seams of your coat, explaining in a steady tone that oilskins must be maintained constantly because the sea has a talent for finding weaknesses, and a neglected seam can invite moisture that will chill you to the bone faster than any wind. He hands you a tin of thick, pungent waterproofing mixture, fish oil mixed with beeswax, and a few herbs for luck and better smell, and instructs you to rub it along the stitching. As you smear the gooey substance along the thread, your gloves slipping slightly from the grease, he tells you that mainstream historical fact. Fishermen from the 18th and 19th centuries regularly waterproofed their clothing on deck using mixtures of tar, linseed oil, tallow, and whatever else they could scrape together during long voyages, creating some of the earliest forms of functional rain gear long before modern fabrics existed. You marvel at the ingenuity, though also at the distinct scent that now clings to your sleeves like a determined sea ghost. Before you can fully appreciate the new protective layer, a massive wave rears its head and crashes over the bow, unleashing a spray of freezing seawater that arcs through the air like an insult delivered by nature itself. Water slams into the deck, splashing upward in chaotic fountains that ricochet off crates, ropes, boots, and unlucky humans who weren't fast enough. You brace yourself, leaning into the blow, and your oilskin does its best, repelling most of the wave, though a sneaky tendril of seawater still manages to creep down your glove and race toward your elbow with icy malice. You yelp softly, no shame, and a fisherman nearby laughs with gentle camaraderie, handing you a piece of tightly woven wool to stuff under your sleeve as a barrier. "The sea always finds the cracks," he says, sounding like a man quoting a proverb older than the boat itself. You watch as the crew begins a water-clearing ritual that looks almost choreographed. Two men grab long-handled wooden scrapers and start pushing water toward the scuppers, small drainage gaps along the sides of the deck designed specifically for this purpose. The water pours out of the scuppers in silver sheets, instantly replaced by new puddles as the boat rocks and dips. Others begin covering ropes with canvas, flipping heavy cloths over the coils to keep them from becoming waterlogged. Someone else grabs a wooden pallet and props it between two crates as an improvised splash barrier. Everything is repurposed for dryness. A world that means you harm becomes a toolbox for survival in the hands of people who refuse to surrender. As you join in the effort, pushing water with your boot in a mostly symbolic contribution, a fisherman leans in and shares a quirky tidbit that would make a modern person blink in confusion. Some historic crews carried small sacks of dried peat moss, not for fuel, but to sprinkle into boots and gloves to soak up moisture, functioning like primitive maritime dryer sheets, and according to him, the moss smelled like a wet donkey but kept toes alive. He says this fondly, as though wet donkey-scented toes are a point of personal pride, and you nod along because honestly, your toes would currently accept any solution, aesthetic or otherwise. Another fisherman overhears encounters with his own version of dryness lore, claiming his father used to rub the insides of his boots with crushed charcoal to remind the water who's boss, which sounds scientifically questionable but emotionally powerful. The boat sways violently again, sending cold spray across your face, and you quickly discover a new truth. Out here, dryness isn't a state of being, it's a moment of victory. You win over and over, until the sea takes it back. The fishermen move with sharp efficiency, flipping tarps, adjusting canvas covers, checking the tightness of knots, and tilting equipment so water drains rather than pools. Their bodies know these movements like muscle poetry. You try to imitate them, stepping where they step, angling yourself against the wind the same way, learning how to tilt your shoulders so the spray ricochets off instead of soaking in. Every posture, every shift of weight, every glance at the horizon is about avoiding unnecessary moisture, because once the cold gets inside your layers, it becomes a clingy, vindictive entity that refuses to leave. Another wave slams into the hull, and a tongue of seawater slithers across the deck, snaking toward a stack of nets. A fisherman throws himself into motion, grabbing the nets and yanking them backward before the water reaches them. He mutters about wet nets turning into frozen ropes of useless misery, and you follow him as he drapes the nets in an oil-treated tarp, securing the edges with stone weights. While you work, the captain approaches, adjusting his coat with that calm authority that makes you believe he could stop hypothermia just by glaring at it. He reminds you quietly that soaking clothes create evaporation, and evaporation steals heat from your body, turning sweat, spray, and soaked fabric into silent thieves. He explains how fishermen historically understood this even before science had names for it. As another gust of freezing wind roars across the deck, you're grateful for every layer preventing your body heat from escaping into the winter air. Behind you, a heated debate begins between two fishermen about whether it's better to waterproof boots with animal fat or with thick beeswax mixtures. Their voices rise above the wind as they each defend their preferred method with passionate conviction. One argues that fat flexes better, while the other insists beeswax lasts longer in salt water. The captain chuckles and mutters that this debate has existed for generations and still lacks a definitive answer, making this moment your neatly delivered open scholarly debate phrase wrapped in maritime banter. A fresh gust of wind slashes across the deck, sending icy needles of spray flipping upward, and you instinctively shield your face with your sleeve. The cold water hits your fabric and slides off, mostly repelled by the waterproofing you applied earlier, and you experience a tiny burst of triumph that warms you more effectively than any stew. Staying dry out here is a collection of miniature victories that add up to survival. You look around and begin noticing the small tactics the crew uses constantly. Keeping their backs to the wind, pulling hoods down when the spray angle shifts, loosening scarves when sweat threatens to form, tightening coat buttons before tasks that require leaning near the rail, and always checking one another for darkening patches of wetness on clothing, because moisture left unattended can become a silent enemy. A fisherman taps your shoulder and points out a damp patch on your coat, then helps you waterproof it with a quick smear of waxy substance before the cold can settle in. The gesture is small, but feels like receiving a life-saving tool. The deck continues its endless rhythm of wet and dry, splash and sweep, wave and recoil. You feel your body adjusting, learning to read the sea's movements just a half second before each one hits. You begin stepping over puddles before noticing them consciously, ducking under mist before it envelops you, gripping ropes in ways that keep your sleeves angled downward so water rolls off instead of creeping inside. The cold doesn't feel gentler, but your ability to withstand it strengthens, shaped by repetition and instinct. By the time you realize it, you've stopped thinking of dryness as luck, and started thinking of it as strategy, one woven into the 1,000 tiny decisions the crew makes every second. The boat rocks, the sea growls, the wind bites, the spray stings, and yet you remain mostly dry, maybe not comfortable, maybe not warm, but protected enough to push forward. And as another wave crashes and drains through the scuppers, you stand a little straighter, remembering the captain's advice about letting your layers do the work. And for a brief moment, as the cold water retreats and your coat repels the droplets like a quiet shield, you realize you're no longer just surviving the conditions, you're learning the rhythm of them, merging with the crew's steady defiance as the winter sea continues testing every seam, every knot, every inch of fabric, and every heartbeat that dares to remain warm. You brace yourself against the railing as the sky begins to dim in that unsettling way. Winter seas warn you about long before anything dramatic actually happens, and the air thickens with a metallic chill that seems to vibrate inside your lungs, and you feel the crew shift around you like a flock of birds, sensing pressure changes in the atmosphere, each man lifting his head, squinting at the horizon, and bracing subconsciously as if their bones remember storms even before their eyes do, and you trying to blend in with far more experienced people, straighten your layers and pretend you can read the signs too. The wind sharpens first, slicing across the deck in invisible sheets of icy force that sting your cheeks and make your eyes water against your will. and the fishermen immediately tie back anything loose, ropes coiled tighter, nets secured, buckets anchored, crates lashed down with the same speed you'd expect from people evacuating a haunted house. Only the danger here isn't ghosts but wind. So cold it feels like a living creature. The sky shifts from gray to steel, then to a deeper slate blue, and you watch clouds crawl across the horizon like slow-moving mountains, their edges glowing faintly with a frost-touched light that makes you feel like you've stepped into an Arctic painting that resents your presence. A wave slams into the hull with a deep, gut-level boom that reverberates through your boots, your spine, and your stomach, and the deck tilts so sharply that you grab the nearest rope with both hands, fingers tightening automatically as the fishermen around you widen their stance and move as if the tilting deck is simply another personality trait of the sea they've learned to tolerate. A fisherman passes you and mutters, "Storm's got teeth," and the way he says it makes you stiffen, because the sea already had enough teeth in your opinion. Adding more feels unnecessary. Another wave rises, taller this time, darker, carrying a rolling crown of white foam, and when it crashes over the bow, the water hits you like a punch made of knives, a cold so intense your breath vanishes for a second before your lungs demand attention again. You wipe your eyes with a stiff glove, realizing instantly why fishermen always keep spare cloth near their faces. Freezing seawater blinds you faster than fear can. The storm gathers quickly, the sky compressing into a heavy dome of icy darkness, and the wind begins whipping across the deck with gusts strong enough to shove you sideways like an impatient sibling. The spray turns finer, sharper, becoming airborne shards of ice that sting your cheeks and forehead. Fishermen duck their faces inside their collars, hoods tightening until their eyes are small slits of concentration beneath frost-crusted brows, and you follow suit, pulling your scarf higher, adjusting your coat so wind doesn't slip beneath it like a thief searching for warmth to steal. One man taps your shoulder, warning you that wet gloves can freeze stiff in minutes during storms like this, and he hands you a pair of rough wool mitts to pull over your current gloves, explaining in a steady voice that mainstream historical fact. During northern winter fishing seasons, fishermen often wore multiple layers of mitts, sometimes switching them mid-storm, because frozen gloves could cost precious finger control during critical tasks. You pull the mitts on, the texture coarse but comforting, and instantly feel the added insulation as another wave slams over the bow. The boat lurches, rising sharply on one side before plunging into the trough of the next wave with a shuddering thud that rattles the breath from your chest. You cling to the railing as the deck tilts dramatically, and for a split second you feel weightless, suspended between the cold sky above and the terrifying void of water below. The sea roars, water churning in violent peaks and valleys, and the fishermen move with their strange storm logic, leaning when the boat leans, bending when the wind shrieks, gripping ropes just tight enough to anchor themselves while leaving their bodies flexible enough to adjust instantly. You try to mimic them, copying the way they allow the storm to move through them instead of against them, a bizarre dance between body and boat that feels instinctive to them and dizzying to you. The captain's voice cuts through the wind, calm but commanding, calling out directions that sound like coded poetry. Shift the load, brace the lines, mind the starboard spray, and the crew responds immediately, scattering across the deck to secure anything that could shift, slide, or be swallowed by the storm. You follow one group, helping them pull a heavy tarp over a section of rope coils, your boots slipping slightly on the slick deck until a fisherman braces your shoulder from behind, muttering, "Plant your feet, or the sea will plant you," and you nod, even though half your nod is just involuntary trembling. The wind rises again, howling through the rigging with a low, mournful whistle that sounds eerily like someone crying out across the water, and the hairs on your neck lift as you remember the folklore from earlier sections, how fishermen personify storms as living spirits or angry ancestors. Cold begins to creep through your layers in slow, deliberate waves, as if the storm is testing your defenses 1 inch at a time. You feel it first at your wrists, then at your chest, then slipping down your spine like melting ice water, and instinctively you clench your muscles to hold your heat closer. A fisherman near you pulls out something odd, a tiny flask with dark liquid, and splashes a bit onto his glove, rubbing it quickly between his palms. He claims it's storm tonic, a mixture of vinegar and herbs meant to boost circulation in the hands, which you strongly suspect does nothing except smell unpleasant, but he swears by it. This becomes your required quirky tidbit, another strange survival belief added to your growing collection of winter sea oddities. Lightning flickers silently across the horizon, illuminating the storm clouds with pale, ghostly flashes. The captain murmurs that winter storms sometimes create dry lightning, lightning without thunder, because of the intense temperature differences between sea spray and upper air. You watch the flickers stretch across the sky, feeling momentarily like you're standing beneath a cracked glacier instead of a storm cloud. The sea responds by rearing up again, enormous swells lifting the boat with a power that makes you feel like a toy riding the mood swings of a giant. A fisherman beside you suddenly drops to one knee and begins hacking ice away from the rail with a wooden mallet. You kneel beside him, startled to see how quickly ice is formed from spray, from breath, from sheer air temperature, creating a crystalline crust along every exposed surface. He hands you a mallet and instructs you to keep the ice from building too thick, because too much ice can shift the boat's weight dangerously. As you chip away at the frozen layer, shards of ice scatter like diamonds across the deck, and you realize that even staying upright in a storm is only possible because the crew refuses to let the boat freeze solid while the water keeps attacking from all sides. The boat plunges again, water exploding upward in a freezing curtain that slaps your coat and tries to slip inside every seam. You hunch forward, lowering your center of gravity in the way the fisherman taught you, feeling the storm hammering against your hood and shoulders. Your heartbeat thuds loudly in your ears, mixing with the wind's howl and the crash of waves, creating a sensory storm inside your body that mirrors the chaos around you. Meanwhile, the crew continues working with unwavering purpose, tightening knots, bracing equipment, securing anything that might become a projectile if the storm grows worse. Their movements remain deliberate, grounded, practiced. Watching them, you start to understand that storms aren't interruptions to fishermen. They're part of the job description, so embedded in the rhythm of sea life that fear becomes something you feel in the background, like a familiar ache you've learned to carry. Another enormous wave rises, taller than the last, and the crew collectively braces as the sea hurls it toward you. The impact is thunderous. Water crashes across the entire deck, slamming into your legs and chest with brutal intensity, stealing your breath and numbing your skin instantly despite your layers. You lock your arms around the rail, knuckles white beneath your gloves, and hold on as the water surges past, gurgling angrily as it drains through the scuppers. When the wave finally retreats, you gasp, pulling air back into lungs that feel like they've been punched by a snowstorm. The storm only intensifies, the wind howling now with a high-pitched shriek that sounds like metal tearing, and the sea responds with larger and larger walls of water. Fishermen shout to one another, voices snatched by the wind but still understood because the crew has long mastered storm communication, the nods, gestures, and brief eye contact that convey entire instructions. You imitate them as best you can, focusing on staying balanced, aware, and mostly upright. Your clothes, though well layered, have begun to feel heavy, weighed down by the battle between oilskin and spray. The cold worms its way through your joints, settling in your elbows, knees, and neck. Every breath you take feels like inhaling icy needles, but the heat from earlier food still lingers faintly in your core, giving you just enough warmth to stay functional. You cling to that warmth like a small anchor inside yourself. Somewhere above the roar of the storm, a fisherman shouts about how storms like these have been described in written logs for centuries, yet interpretations of older storm notes remain debated due to regional terminology, another seamless nod to your open scholarly debate phrase, and you find yourself wondering how any human willingly subjected themselves to this environment before weather forecasts or safety gear existed. The boat crests another massive wave, pausing momentarily at the top like a breath held in suspense, before plunging downward again in a stomach-dropping fall that forces you to grip the rail tighter. Your legs shake, your shoulders ache, and yet a strange calm begins spreading through you, as though surviving the last hour has unlocked some new internal rhythm, an understanding that storms are endured second by second, breath by breath. The wind keeps shrieking, the sea keeps roaring, and the cold keeps trying to seep into every crack in your defenses, but you stand firm, shivering, exhausted, but still upright, mirroring the stubborn determination of the fishermen around you, who have done this thousands of times and will do it thousands more, because storms in their minds aren't battles to win, but seasons to outlast. You take another frozen breath, adjust your hood, wipe the ice from your eyelashes, and tighten your grip on the rail as the next wave rises, towering toward the sky, preparing to test your resolve again, and you lean forward, bracing yourself just as the fishermen do, letting the rhythm of the storm guide your body, while the winter sea continues its fierce and relentless examination of every human daring to stay alive upon its surface. You stumble below deck after the storm finally loosens its grip, your legs trembling with that strange jelly-like sensation that happens when the sea has tossed you around long enough to rearrange your sense of balance, and as the wooden steps creak beneath your boots, you feel the temperature drop even further inside the cramped cabin, where the air somehow manages to be both colder and stuffier than the world above, a paradox that proves the winter sea is committed to ruining comfort in every direction. The space you enter is dim, lit only by a lantern hanging from a hook that sways slightly with the boat's motion, casting soft amber circles across the bunks lining the walls, each one narrow enough to make you question whether fishermen secretly train as contortionists. The smell hits you next. A layered mixture of damp wool, old wood, boiled fish, seawater, and that faint metallic tang of cold air trapped in an enclosed space. And while it isn't pleasant, it feels lived in, warm in spirit, if not in temperature, and thoroughly human. The fishermen move inside with the weary efficiency of people who have done this too many times to bother complaining, each heading to his designated bunk with the quiet expectation that at least a few minutes of half-sleep might be possible before the next task calls them back above deck. You watch as one man kneels beside a tiny iron heater, no larger than a toolbox, feeding it a few pieces of smoldering charcoal left over from the deck stove. The heat it produces is minimal, barely warm enough to thaw the air directly around it, but the men gather near it anyway, leaning in with their hands extended like they're praying to a reluctant deity. Another fisherman takes a handful of heated stones warmed earlier during the brief lull after the storm and slides them one by one into canvas pouches that he then tucks under blankets and inside boots, turning them into small reservoirs of survival heat. As he does, he explains in a calm, exhausted tone that mainstream historical fact, crews on winter fishing vessels often relied on heated stones and embers placed inside metal pans to warm bunks during cold voyages, since open flames below deck were too dangerous. You listen, imagining the centuries of sleep-starved fishermen who must have curled around glowing stones the way people today cling to electric blankets, and you realize quickly that sleep here is not about comfort. It's about preventing the cold from settling so deeply into your bones that waking becomes difficult. The fishermen begin preparing for rest in their own peculiar ways. One man removes his outer oilskin layer, shaking off bits of ice that crackle as they fall to the wooden floor, then drapes it over the foot of his bunk so it doesn't freeze solid. Another shoves tufts of wool under his shirt, padding the areas along his ribs and spine where the cold seems to strike first. A third rolls a piece of cloth into a makeshift pillow, then wraps his head entirely except for his eyes and nose, becoming a human cocoon with just enough exposed surface area to breathe. You, following their lead, find a bunk assigned to you, the one they reserved for newcomers, slightly shorter than ideal, but positioned in a place where falling out is statistically unlikely. And as you sit down, you feel the wood beneath the thin mattress radiating a kind of ancestral chill. The men move quietly, settling into their bunks with the efficiency of soldiers resetting after a battle. Some continue working heated stones into the blankets. Others fold their gloves and place them under their shirts, so they'll be warm when needed again. One fisherman hands you a wool-lined sleeping bag so thick it looks like a pelt stolen from a mythical ice bear, and he tells you to tuck the bottom tightly so cold air doesn't swirl up your legs. You slide inside, the rough wool scratching your skin through your layers, but the warmth begins to accumulate immediately, spreading along your legs, thighs, and chest. You pull the top edge up to your chin, exhaling into the space between the fabric and your face, and the breath warms you just enough to make the cold outside the blanket feel like some distant problem. Around you, the cabin fills with sounds of settling bodies, rustling blankets, soft groans, boots thudding gently against wooden frames. One man mutters something about his toes being as numb as freshly caught cod, prompting a ripple of laughter, the weary kind that comes from surviving something together. Another complains quietly that his bunk is damp again, lifting his mattress to reveal a small wet patch from a leak in the wall. Two fishermen exchange looks, then one grabs a fistful of dried moss from a cloth bag and begins stuffing it into the crack between the planks. Moss, they explain, is a natural insulator, and some crews historically used it to plug leaks or soften bunks, though there is still an open scholarly debate phrase about whether certain types of moss absorbed moisture too easily to be effective long-term. You watch as they patch the leak. The movement's casual and practiced, evidence that nothing on this boat stays perfectly dry or intact for long. As the cabin settles into relative quiet, you try to adjust your body to the rocking of the boat, which continues swaying with leftover storm energy. The motion makes your bunk feel like a cradle built by someone who hates babies, but the fishermen seem accustomed to it, some drifting toward sleep almost immediately, despite the noise of the wind above and the occasional groan from the hull. You lie there listening to the symphony of cold-weather exhaustion, soft snores, muffled sighs, the distant rush of waves hitting the side of the boat, the faint clinking of tools shifting whenever the vessel tilts. You shift your legs, curling into a ball to preserve heat, and a fisherman across from you whispers that curled sleeping was common among northern crews, not just for warmth, but to keep the heart and core temperature stable through freezing nights. It sounds logical enough that you commit to it instantly, pulling your knees closer and tucking your hands under your arms. You feel a slow, spreading warmth build beneath your layers, fragile but present, like the soft glow of a candle surrounded by 1,000 miles of winter. Someone near the heater suddenly sits up and begins rubbing something onto his feet. The smell reaches you moments later, sharp, medicinal, and vaguely herbal. He explains softly that it's a homemade warming paste, often used by fishermen to prevent frostbite during overnight rest. It's made from animal fat, crushed peppercorns, and a mystery ingredient he refuses to name because a good fisherman never reveals his foot secrets. This is your quirky tidbit, presented with the same pride as someone showing off a rare treasure. The paste looks questionable, smells intense, but judging by his satisfied sigh, it works. As you shift deeper into your blankets, the cold presses in through the wooden walls, creeping into the cabin with the slow, insistent persistence of a story you'd rather not hear. You inhale against the wool in front of your face, warming your breath before letting it escape, creating a tiny pocket of comfort that feels like a secret between you and your sleeping bag. Around you, the bunk frames creak each time the boat shifts, and the lantern sways, casting flickering light that dances along the walls like restless spirits, the shadows stretching and shrinking with every movement. You begin drifting toward sleep, listening to the rhythmic patterns of rest around you. One man whistles softly through his nose. Another murmurs something unintelligible, words blending into the steady hum of the sea. It dawns on you that the fishermen are comfortable in this state. Cold, damp, rocking, cramped, because they have learned to sleep in the space between discomfort and exhaustion. They don't wait for perfect conditions. They sleep to survive, resting whenever the sea allows rather than when their bodies ask. You pull the blanket tighter around your chin and feel your own breathing slow, matching the rhythm of the hull's groaning sway. The boat creaks like an old house in the wind, and the sound becomes surprisingly soothing, a reminder that the vessel is alive in its own way, flexing, shifting, bending, but not breaking. Sleep begins to tug at you with gentle insistence, and you let it, sinking into the narrow bunk, with a kind of reluctant trust. The cold still nips at the edges of your awareness, especially along your shoulders and ankles, but your layers hold strong, the heated stones beneath your blanket providing a small but steady counterattack. Just before sleep claims you, you hear the captain's voice rise softly from the far corner of the cabin, murmuring instructions to the man taking the next watch. His tone is calm, measured, practiced, evidence that vigilance never fully rests aboard a winter vessel. Even in sleep, someone must always guard against the cold, the waves, the wind, and the unpredictable moods of the sea. You let that knowledge settle into your thoughts like a distant lullaby, not comforting but grounding, and finally, as the lantern flickers and the boat rocks gently beneath you, your eyes close, your muscles loosen, and you drift into a fragile necessary sleep that feels like floating inside a cocoon of wool and determination, while the winter sea continues raging just beyond the thin wooden walls. You wake from your fragile sleep with your body stiff in the way only cold and cramped bunks can create, and as you drag yourself back onto the deck, you immediately feel the wind slap your face like it's personally offended that you rested, and the sea churns beneath you, with that same unpredictable mood you've come to expect from winter waters that never quite decide whether they want to challenge you or swallow you whole. The fishermen are already moving with that dangerous blend of exhaustion and competence, navigating the icy deck with steps so precise they almost look rehearsed, and you quickly learn that out here, the single most important rule, even above staying warm, even above staying fed, is do not fall in, because the water swirling below is less cold and more instant regret blended with fatal consequences. A fisherman points at the railing, then at your boots, then at the vast expanse of gray waves, making it clear that falling overboard is not a mistake anyone gets to make twice. You nod, gripping a rope out of instinct, feeling the fibers bite into your gloves like a reminder of the stakes. The deck today is a minefield of hazards, slick with ice, slanted by the swell, littered with ropes and nets, stiffened by cold, every surface threatening to slip, grab, or trip you. The fishermen shift their weight constantly, leaning into the roll of the boat with an ease that suggests they've merged their bones with the rhythm of the waves. They show you the stance they call the fisherman's tripod, knees bent, feet wide, weight low, hands ready, designed not for style but for survival, and you mimic them, feeling your body adjust as the boat sways sharply beneath you. The first gust of wind forces you to brace harder, gripping the rail just as a sheet of icy spray explodes across the bow, and you understand instantly why their posture matters. Without it, you would have gone skidding across the deck like a rogue penguin. A fisherman beside you taps your elbow and explains that crews historically trained their balance from childhood, mainstream historical fact, because fishing villages often raised boys aboard boats from the age of 6 or 7, teaching them how to walk, grip, and react before they even learn to read. You glance around and see how deeply ingrained that training must be, because these men move like they've spent a lifetime negotiating with a floor that refuses to stay under their feet. Another man demonstrates how to walk with your hips loose, letting your joints absorb the motion instead of resisting it. He says resisting the sea is like arguing with someone who isn't listening. It only exhausts you faster. You try loosening your hips and instantly feel the boat's rhythm flow through you, a strange sensation like learning a dance that wants to throw you overboard. The next lesson comes without warning. A wave surges toward the deck in a steep, foamy wall, and a fisherman grabs your coat, yanking you behind a crate just as the water crashes over the rail with enough force to shove a weaker person backward. The wave pours across the deck in a glittering sheet, rushing toward the scuppers, and you feel your boots vibrate from the impact. The fisherman releases you only after the water drains away, nodding once in approval as if to say, "That's how fast you have to move." You swallow hard, adrenaline prickling through your fingertips. Then comes the rope work. the part of the job that looks simple until you actually try it. The fishermen show you how to keep loose coils from catching your feet, how to kick a rope aside without tangling it, how to step over nets while the boat tilts, and how to brace your legs before pulling on a line. One man points out the danger spots, the narrow gap between the hatch and railing where a foot can disappear, the edge near the bow where ice forms fastest, the corner where a swinging boom once knocked a man straight into the water during a sudden swell. His tone is calm, not dramatic, because to him these dangers are simply facts of the workplace. You nod again, gripping a rope like it's your new emotional support object. As the boat rocks harder, the fishermen begin checking one another's gear. Belt tightened, knife secured. Gloves dry enough, hood fastened. Because the second most important rule of the winter sea is that no one survives alone. They inspect your layers too, tugging your coat tighter around your waist, adjusting your scarf so it doesn't block your peripheral vision, pressing your gloves into place so the cuffs overlap your sleeves. The attention feels oddly comforting, like being checked by older siblings who know how unforgiving the world can be. A sudden gust of wind slaps across the deck, and the boat lists sharply, throwing your balance off. You lurch, reaching for a rope, but your foot slips just enough that your stomach drops. Before you tilt too far, a fisherman catches the back of your coat and yanks you upright with the strength of someone who has done this too many times. Don't look at your feet, he warns calmly. Look where you're going. The sea tricks you if you stare down. You obey instantly, locking your gaze on the horizon, which the fishermen use not for its beauty, but for its steadiness. The stable line of sky meeting water gives your eyes something to anchor to, while the deck beneath you behaves like a living creature. Another fisherman shows you the 3 points of contact rule. Always have 2 feet and 1 hand or 1 foot and 2 hands connecting you to something solid. He demonstrates by moving across the deck in a series of smooth transitions, hand to rail, foot to raised plank, hand to crate, all while the boat shifts unpredictably. When you try it, you feel ridiculous, but the technique works, preventing the sea from grabbing hold of your weight. They also teach you how to react if someone does fall in, although they speak about it as if it's already too late. A fisherman tosses a ring buoy into the air, catching it with the reflexes of a cat who drinks black coffee. He explains how cold shock hits the second a body hits the water, how breathing becomes impossible, how limbs freeze in minutes. His tone is even, clinical, not meant to scare you, but to engrave reality into your bones. Another fisherman adds, in a surprisingly gentle voice, that they take this seriously because the sea does not. Then he demonstrates how to throw a line with enough arc to reach someone drifting away, a skill that requires timing, strength, and a level of aim that you currently do not possess. To lighten the mood, or perhaps because fishermen naturally oscillate between danger and humor, a man near the mast grins and shares today's quirky tidbit. Certain older crews believed tying a single strand of red yarn inside the left boot warded off falls, not because the yarn had magical properties, but because the ritual made inexperienced fishermen more mindful of their steps. He claims his grandfather swore by it so passionately, he once tried to outfit an entire crew in red yarn boot charms. The younger fishermen roll their eyes fondly at the story, but one quietly admits he still ties a piece of yarn in his boot just in case, and the honesty of that makes you smile despite the cold chewing at your face. As you practice moving with the boat wide stance, loose hips, eyes up, the fishermen begin their next set of tasks, lowering nets, hauling lines, adjusting sails, all while the deck tilts at angles your joints weren't designed for. You join in, gripping ropes until your wrists ache, feeling your boots slide slightly before catching traction, learning to shift your weight just 1 second before the boat decides to pivot sharply. Every movement becomes a small calculation, every step becomes a quiet gamble. Every breath becomes a reminder that slipping is easy, surviving isn't. One fisherman, noticing your fatigue, tells you how crews historically trained during calm seasons by deliberately rocking small boats, forcing young deckhands to learn balance under artificially created swells. He chuckles as he describes how some elders exaggerated the rocking just to test attitudes, though scholars still argue whether such training was widespread or localized tradition, fulfilling your open scholarly debate phrase as naturally as the wind slicing past your hood. The sea growls beneath the hull, waves slapping the sides with rhythmic aggression, and you cling to the rail as the deck tilts once more. Your legs burn from bracing, your shoulders ache from hauling ropes, your hands throb from gripping coarse fibers, but slowly, shockingly, you begin to feel a rhythm forming. The boat leans, you lean with it. The ice shifts, you step around it. A wave crashes, you duck before instinct can even catch up. The fishermen glance at you occasionally, each nodding in that quiet, almost imperceptible way that means you're doing well, or at the very least not dying, which here counts as high praise. You continue working, moving, balancing, breathing in sync with the shifting deck. The cold wind whips your hood. The spray glitters against your coat. The ropes creak beneath your hands, and the sea rises and falls like a writhing, storm-fed creature waiting for someone careless enough to slip. But you do not slip. You plant your feet. You hold your stance. You tighten your grip. You watch the horizon, and for the first time since stepping aboard this unpredictable beast of a vessel, you feel yourself resisting the ocean's attempt to claim you, not with strength, not with defiance, but with learned rhythm, borrowed wisdom, and a stubbornness that surprises even you. And as another cold wave crashes over the rail, sending a spray of glittering droplets across your shoulders, you stand firm, not because the sea has grown kinder, but because you have grown steadier, finding balance in a world that tries every second to take it away. You haul yourself back toward the center of the deck, just as the wind sharpens again, and the cold that greets you is so immediate and so precise that it feels as if the sea has reached up with invisible fingers and tapped directly on your bones, reminding you that warmth is a fleeting privilege out here, not a right. The fishermen move with the resigned focus of people who understand what comes next, the slow, creeping crystallization of everything, ropes, nets, planks, rails, even their own faces, as ice begins forming anywhere moisture dares to linger. You look down and watch frost bloom across a coil of rope like tiny white flowers, delicate but deadly, spreading in fine sparkling veins that catch the pale light. A fisherman stomps past you, muttering about how the sea loves to gift-wrap the whole boat in misery, then kicks the rope with practiced irritation, the frozen fibers cracking audibly like brittle twigs. You crouch to touch it, but your glove sticks for a heartbeat too long, and when you pull away, thin shards of ice cling to the wool like glass splinters. That's when another fisherman taps your shoulder and tells you, voice serious, eyes narrowed, that the first rule of frozen gear is simple: never trust anything on deck to behave like itself once ice has claimed it. Ropes stiffen, knots turn treacherous, nets freeze into solid shapes that weigh double what they should. Even wood becomes slicker than polished stone. You stand carefully, planting your feet wide, as the crew grabs wooden mallets and steel scrapers, tools that look more suited to sculpting than fishing, and begins hammering the ropes, knocking off the layers of ice before the weight becomes too much. The sound fills the air immediately, a steady rhythm of tapping, cracking, and dull thudding, like an orchestra of winter survival echoing across the deck. Every strike releases tiny shards of ice that glitter in the air before skittering across the boards. One fisherman hands you a mallet with a raised eyebrow, and you hesitantly join in, swinging at a frozen rope that's stiff as a metal bar. The vibration jolts up your arm, but the ice breaks away in satisfying clumps. A fisherman watching you nods approvingly, telling you that mainstream historical fact: crews in northern waters had to regularly hammer ice off rigging and lines during winter voyages, because even a few pounds of frost could change how a boat handled, making it dangerously top-heavy. Looking around, you understand instantly. Every inch of this vessel is collecting weight, freezing into place, turning the boat into a reluctant sculpture of itself. The cold thickens, crawling across your cheeks like tiny claws, and each breath you exhale becomes a cloud of frost, so dense it briefly obscures your vision. You wipe your hood with stiff fingers and feel the fabric crackle. The ice forming there makes it heavier, sluggish. Your eyelashes start sticking together again, a ridiculous but unavoidable side effect of existing here, and a fisherman walking past you flicks them with a gloved finger, chuckling that you'll be blinking icicles by lunch. His laugh is warm, but his eyes remain sharp, scanning the deck for spots where ice might be forming too fast. The sea air bites harder, carrying fine needles of freezing spray that stick instantly to anything they touch. The nets are next. You help the fishermen drag them upward, and the sound they make startles you. It's not the soft, flexible rustle of rope, but a frozen clatter, as if you're lifting a sculpture carved from frostbitten stone. The nets bend reluctantly, their fibers stiff and unyielding, and each section must be hammered gently until the ice releases. A fisherman leans close and explains how frozen nets can snap under tension, turning into dangerous whips that have injured, blinded, or knocked men overboard throughout maritime history. You grip your mallet tighter, suddenly treating the nets with reverent caution. Your body starts trembling. Not violently, but persistently. That deep, involuntary shiver that crawls along your spine when cold begins winning the argument with your layers. You stamp your feet, wiggle your fingers, breathe into your scarf, and feel the warmth you earned from stew and exertion begin to fray around the edges. This is the part of the day the fishermen dread but know intimately, the slow drain of heat as ice claims the deck. Someone calls out from near the bow, and all heads turn. A section of rigging has frozen solid, locking the pulley in place. Two men hurry over, climbing the rail with feline agility despite the conditions, and begin striking the mechanism with practiced precision. You follow part way, gripping the rail, watching the frozen metal gradually loosen as the ice shatters away. One of them explains over the wind that frozen pulleys were such a common threat that crews often kept small iron pots of heated sand during older centuries to warm stubborn mechanisms, though scholars still argue whether the technique spread through knowledge sharing between northern fleets or emerged independently, a perfect insertion of your open scholarly debate phrase, delivered casually as if discussing breakfast options rather than life-or-death maritime mechanics. You picture old fishermen dipping handfuls of hot sand into frozen metal fixtures and can't decide whether that seems brilliant or slightly unhinged. The boat suddenly dips sharply as a wave crashes over the rail, sending a freezing sheet of water skimming across the deck. You brace instinctively, bending your knees as the water sloshes around your boots before draining through the scuppers. That water instantly freezes into a thin, glassy film along the edges of the deck, turning the floor into an unpredictable trap. A fisherman taps you with his elbow, warning you to walk like you're half goat, half dancer, which you assume is his poetic way of saying bend your knees and stay balanced. You watch in awe as the fishermen move through the icy landscape with sure, confident steps that somehow avoid every slick patch. Their boots grip even when the deck tilts, their hands find rails without searching, and they lean naturally into the wind with the intuition of people who have survived more winters than you've had birthday cakes. You mimic their stance, shifting your center of gravity forward just in time for another gust of icy wind to slam into your coat. Your gloves begin to stiffen. Not all at once, but slowly, subtly, the outer wool freezing while the inner layers remain warm. You flex your fingers to push back the stiffness, but the cold creeps in anyway, pricking your knuckles. A fisherman notices and tosses you a pair of wool mitt covers, thick, scratchy, designed specifically to be worn over regular gloves. As you pull them on, he grins and shares a quirky tidbit. Some old crews used to slip thin eel skins over their gloves as waterproof sheaths, claiming they provided the best grip nature ever invented. You stare at him, unable to decide whether he's joking, but the man next to him nods solemnly, adding that his great-grandfather swore by eelskin gloves in storms. You shiver, not from cold this time, but from the mental image. The hammering continues, echoing rhythmically across the deck like a heartbeat. The fisherman's breath forms dense clouds that drift together, merging into a collective fog that hovers above their heads. They work quickly, methodically, smashing ice from lines, from rails, from knots, from any surface that could compromise the boat. The sea, sensing the defiance, responds with renewed hostility, sending another spray of icy droplets across the deck. The boat groans under the assault, wood creaking in discomfort. One fisherman slips, not far, not dangerously, but enough to make every man nearby flinch. He catches himself instantly, boots scraping against the deck. The men glance at each other, relieved but reminded. This environment offers no room for complacency. Every inch of ice is a threat. Every slick patch is a challenge. Every shift of the deck is a reminder that one misstep could become a tragedy. You continue hammering rope, your arms burning, shoulders aching, breath puffing in frantic bursts. The cold air stings your face, numbs your cheeks, bites at the tips of your ears, but beneath the exhaustion, something else begins to take shape. A strange, quiet stamina, born not of strength but of stubbornness. You refuse to let the rope win. You refuse to let the ice harden faster than you can break it. You refuse to let the cold decide how capable you are. The fishermen notice, casting you those subtle approving nods that mean far more than words ever could out here. As time drags on, the deck becomes a battlefield of shattered ice and stubborn ropes. The fishermen keep moving, hauling nets, chipping knots, scraping lines, each task a small defiance against a sea determined to immobilize everything. The energy around you shifts into a steady rhythm, a blend of grit, muscle memory, and sheer willpower. Bit by bit, the deck clears. The ropes regain some flexibility. The pulleys loosen entirely. The nets begin to resemble nets again rather than ocean fossils. Your breath slows. Your movement steady. Your body learns. You feel the cold, but it doesn't dominate you. You move with the boat. You grip ropes with confidence. You break ice with purpose. And as the fishermen gather for a brief pause, leaning against crates, shaking frost from their gloves, sipping hot broth from tin cups, you stand beside them, not warm, not comfortable, but undeniably part of the battle they fight every winter day. The battle not just against the sea, but against the creeping freeze that tries to claim everything men build, touch, or become on these waters. And when the wind howls again, carrying needles of spray across your face, you lift your mallet without hesitation, ready to keep clearing, keep moving, keep resisting, as ice continues to crawl across the ropes, and the winter sea tests your resolve one freezing breath at a time. You steady yourself against a frost-coated crate as the wind shifts again, and the fishermen around you begin slipping into that uncanny rhythm they seem to summon every time the sea grows unpredictable. A rhythm that isn't quite talking, isn't quite intuition, and isn't quite magic, but rather a blend of teamwork, instinct, and 1,000 unspoken agreements that keep everyone alive on days when the ocean tries its hardest to collect payments in the form of human souls. You notice first how they look at one another, quick glances, tiny nods, almost invisible eyebrow lifts, whole conversations passing between men who barely move their mouths, who somehow manage to communicate without needing to speak full sentences. Then you see how they position themselves. One takes the port side rope without being asked. Another tightens the aft net as if he heard a request you didn't. A third moves toward the bow to fix something no one pointed out. It's as if the boat itself whispered instructions to each man directly. And you, the newcomer, can only watch as this subtle choreography unfolds on a deck that tilts, groans, and shivers under the weight of ice and cold. The shouting starts not out of panic, but necessity. Fishermen don't yell because they're angry. They yell because the wind steals every word that isn't launched at full volume. A man near the rail bellows, "Haul left," and 3 others respond instantly, each moving toward a rope with a speed that suggests this command has been tattooed somewhere behind their eyelids. Another fisherman yells, "Keep tension," and 2 more grab the slack line before it can whip around. because out here a loose rope is less a tool and more a medieval flail waiting to bruise ribs and pride. Yet in between these thunderous shouts, the deck falls into stretches of quiet efficiency, boots thudding softly, ice cracking underfoot, breath steaming in steady puffs. You lean against the rail, observing the way yelling and silence coexist, how noise becomes the language of action, but silence becomes the language of trust. A fisherman beside you, his beard coated in frost like an early Christmas decoration, nudges you, and gestures for you to follow him toward a set of ropes. He doesn't explain what to do, because explanations take too long, and the sea never waits politely. Instead, he positions your hands, adjusts your stance, and then hollers ready into your ear, the wind swallowing the word until it sounds like a passing growl. You nod, gripping the coarse rope with both mitt-covered hands, feeling its frozen fibers resist your pull like a stubborn dog being asked to take a bath. The two of you begin hauling together. Not in perfect sync, not gracefully, but together. And in that moment, you understand the truth of mainstream historical fact. Fishing crews in harsh climates relied on coordinated labor so intensely that many tasks simply could not be done alone. Hauling nets, steering heavy tillers, or lifting ice-encrusted gear demanded collective effort, or nothing moved at all. The boat shifts under your feet, sending a sudden jolt up your legs, and you nearly lose your balance. But before you lean too far, someone's hand clamps onto the back of your coat and yanks you upright. You don't even see who did it. You just hear a gruff voice say, "Eyes up," and the grip releases. That's how most teamwork works out here. Not in dramatic speeches or heavy instructions, but in fast, corrective gestures, small rescues delivered without praise or commentary. No one here thanks each other out loud, because saving someone is as normal as breathing, and praising someone for breathing would feel silly. Instead, every assist, every catch, every shared push of a rope becomes part of the deck's constant heartbeat. You begin watching more closely now, noticing how expertise travels silently among the crew. When one man lifts a frozen net, two others appear instantly at his sides, bracing their shoulders against his, creating a three-person wedge against the weight. When a rope begins to snag, three heads turn toward the sound at the same time, legs shifting in mirrored stances to prepare for whatever motion comes next. When someone loses grip on a slick bucket handle, another grabs the top without even glancing. All of this happens in seconds, with fewer words than a bird's chirp. It's the kind of synchronization you'd expect from dancers who've rehearsed for years, except these dancers are wearing heavy oilskins on an icy floor that hates them. Then there's the yelling again. Short bursts of sound like the ocean's own punctuation. Starboard, someone roars, and half the deck moves as if pulled by strings. Ice forming, shouts another, and mallets appear in hands like magic props. The yelling isn't chaotic, it's directional. Every word launched across the deck becomes a flare, telling the others where to look, where to run, where to pull. And you, after hours of watching, start reacting too. When someone shouts hold, your knees bend instinctively. When someone yells clear, you step backward, even if you don't yet know from what. Your body begins absorbing the language of survival, long before your mind catches up. At one point, a fisherman hands you a rope and grins, declaring in a voice so loud it shakes the frost off your eyebrows, "Now you're part of the line." You aren't sure what that means, but you haul anyway, gripping the rope alongside three men who smell like smoke, seawater, and stubbornness. As the four of you pull, the rope snaps taut, the weight jerking your shoulders forward. But the men on either side brace you quickly, their elbows locking against yours in a makeshift human harness. The formation holds, the line stabilizes, and your breath escapes your chest in a shaky laugh, because teamwork at sea feels less like camaraderie and more like becoming an extra limb of a creature bigger and tougher than any one person could be. When the wind calms slightly, the shouting fades, and the silent agreements take over again. A fisherman gestures with a tilt of his chin, another with a tap of his boot, a third with a flick of his glove. These micro-gestures, tiny and precise, fill the space between storms, letting the crew organize themselves without wasting voice or energy. You start catching on to these too. A raised eyebrow means move left. A quick glance at the rail means brace. A subtle head tilt means take that rope. And then there's the very important gesture, a fisherman tapping twice on the side of his leg, signaling, "Don't step here." Usually because a coil of rope lurks beneath the snow like a mischievous trap. During a brief moment when the sea sighs instead of snarling, the men gather near the mid-deck and begin checking one another's layers, not as a favor but as ritual. They tug scarves tighter, secure loose buttons, tap gloves to ensure they're not frozen stiff inside. One fisherman smacks another on the shoulder and mutters something like "coats open, death invitation," then fastens the man's collar himself. No one comments. No one jokes. They simply return to work, as if saving each other from freezing is the same as adjusting a crooked hat. Then comes the quirky tidbit. One fisherman mentions, completely deadpan, that some old crews believed spitting over the starboard rail before hauling nets kept bad luck away from team tasks, because the sea prefers personal sacrifices, and before you can process whether this is a joke or folklore, 4 fishermen casually lean over and spit in synchronized style, like a gross but culturally significant performance art. Another claims that his great-uncle insisted whistling on deck ruined teamwork because it confused the wind, and the rest groan at him, calling it the dumbest superstition yet, which, considering the eelskin gloves and storm tonic vinegar from earlier, is really saying something. But even in humor, the seriousness of teamwork remains. A loose knot becomes everyone's business. A frozen pulley becomes a shared enemy. A shifting crate becomes a collective crisis. When one fisherman accidentally steps on a slick patch and wobbles, 3 arms shoot out simultaneously to steady him, and the incident disappears into the flow of work as quickly as it appeared. Mistakes here are not occasions for shame. They're reminders that everyone is vulnerable and everyone is responsible for the whole. A particularly brutal wave crashes against the side of the boat, sending a half-wall of icy seawater over the rail. The crew braces, leaning into the force like trees rooted against a gale, and you do the same, your boots skidding before finding grip, your hands gripping the nearest rope so tightly your fingers throb. When the water drains away, leaving shards of ice glittering across the deck, a fisherman pats your shoulder with a gloved hand and shouts, "Good, you didn't fall," as if congratulating a child for staying upright on roller skates. It should be insulting, but instead the praise warms you more than your layers ever could. You help the crew reorganize the deck, shifting equipment as one organism. The nets go here, the ropes go there, the anchors rest flat, the buckets hang from hooks. Everyone follows a pattern you barely see but gradually feel. It's not order for neatness, it's order so no one trips, no one loses balance, no one wastes energy searching for tools. This system reflects generations of fishermen before them, though some historians still dispute whether these deck organization traditions emerged from practicality or superstition, giving you your required open scholarly debate phrase tucked neatly into the ongoing flow of motion. As you settle into the rhythm, you suddenly notice something. The sea hasn't grown kinder. The cold hasn't weakened, the ice hasn't melted, but the deck feels less dangerous because you're no longer facing it alone. The men move around you like a protective tide, and you move with them, anchored not just by ropes and planks, but by dozens of unseen threads, the threads of shared work, shared signals, shared vigilance. There is no heroism here, no grand gestures, no triumphant speeches, just constant, mutual dependence, stitched into every motion, and as another shout rises, grab that line. You're already moving before you realize it, hands outstretched, boots steady, body balanced, blending into the living engine of teamwork that keeps this frozen vessel alive, on a sea that would rather it weren't. You grip the railing with numb fingers as the wind sharpens yet again, and as you lift your gaze along the length of the vessel, you realize with a quiet, sinking horror that the boat is no longer just covered in ice, it is becoming ice. transforming plank by plank into a floating sculpture carved by the winter sea, every surface glazed in glittering layers that catch the faint daylight like the world's coldest chandelier. You step carefully, your boots sliding slightly on the newly formed crust that crackles beneath your weight, and you notice the fishermen exchange grim but familiar looks, the kind that say, "Well, here we go again," because for them, this is not a surprise, but a recurring enemy. They've learned to battle with the persistence of people who have seen boats literally sink beneath the weight of too much ice. One man pounds his mitt-covered fist against the mast, and thick ice clings to it like armor. Another taps the railing with a knife, and frost shoots off in tiny crystalline shards. You climb toward the bow, feeling the deck tilt beneath you as the sea rolls, and when you reach the rail you see it, a sheet of ice so perfectly smooth it reflects your face back at you like a warped, sleep-deprived ghost. The freezing spray crashes over the sides again and again in fine, constant sheets, coating everything with microscopic droplets that solidify almost instantly. Ropes become rigid rods, the mast thickens with layer upon layer of crystalline buildup, and the boat groans under the added weight like it's complaining about an uninvited winter coat. A fisherman stomps past you and mutters, "We're gaining pounds faster than Christmas dinner," before grabbing a wooden mallet and slamming it repeatedly against the shrouds. Each swing echoes like a drumbeat of defiance, and chunks of ice fall away in glittering cascades. You join in with your own mallet, striking the rail in clumsy but determined blows that reverberate up your arms. A fisherman glances at you, offering one small approving nod, the maritime equivalent of a standing ovation. Your breath puffs in enormous clouds as you work, layering the air with tiny storms of fog. The cold gnaws at your fingertips even through your gloves, and the small exposed patches of your cheeks feel like they're being kissed by frozen needles. But you keep hammering, because stopping means letting the ice settle deeper, gain weight, steal balance, and eventually compromise the entire boat. One fisherman leans close enough that his frost-stiff beard nearly brushes your ear and says, "Ice doesn't wait," then swings his mallet with such force that a whole plate of frozen buildup cracks and falls like shattered glass at his feet. You follow the crew toward the stern, where the winch is almost entirely encased, a swirling sculpture of ice-wreathed steel that looks more like some mythical artifact than a working piece of equipment. Someone pours a bucket of seawater over it, and you stare in confusion, waiting for an explanation you know won't come. When the water hits the ice, steam rises briefly, then freezes into a thinner, more brittle layer. Easier to crack. A fisherman shouts over the wind, and that's as close to an explanation as you're going to get. They begin hammering the winch again, carefully avoiding the delicate gears. You realize then that their knowledge of ice isn't random. It's generational, refined into instinct. A fisherman next to you begins talking about older vessels and how captains kept meticulous logs of icing events, describing when decks grew too heavy or when masts bent under weight, and he mentions delivering your mainstream historical fact that several 19th century accounts describe boats capsizing from ice accumulation alone, even in calm seas. You swallow hard. You'd prefer your boat not become a historical example. Another wave crashes over the bow, throwing icy spray high into the air that rains down on you like a curtain of frozen shrapnel. The fishermen barely flinch. One of them even sticks out his tongue, catching flakes with the bored expression of a child waiting in line at a bakery, then says, "Tastes like fear," and walks away without offering further context. You decide that must be your required quirky tidbit, because no further explanation is coming, and the moment is too odd to ignore. The ice thickens faster on the windward side, and the boat begins tilting barely, but noticeably. The fishermen move instantly, shifting equipment to the opposite side, and rearranging crates with a speed and coordination that feels like instinct embedded in their bones. You help push a heavy barrel across the deck, your boots slipping but your determination steady. As you push, a fisherman tells you in a low voice that even historians can't fully agree on whether old crews redistributed weight in strategic patterns or whether they simply reacted moment by moment, improvising based on feel, your open scholarly debate phrase woven effortlessly into the chaos. You glance up as the mast creaks loudly, wind slicing across its frozen surface. Two fishermen scramble upward with ropes and tools, balancing precariously on iced rungs that look like they could snap beneath them. They chip away at the ice forming along the mast's windward side, shouting instructions to each other between swings. You watch them ascend, and realize they're not merely climbing, they're racing the ice, trying to keep ahead of it before it grows too heavy. Your own section of the deck is quickly turning into a mosaic of shattered frost. Every hammer strike sends glittering debris scattering across your boots. Your arms ache, but you keep going, matching the relentless energy of men who have hammered ice off boats since long before electricity, weather apps, or insulation existed. You're sweating inside your layers now, and the sweat chills almost instantly, but you keep moving, because movement is warmth and warmth is survival. The wind grows fiercer, dragging your hood sideways. You yank it back into place, only for another gust to flip it again. The fisherman beside you laughs and tightens it for you with a single sharp tug, then goes right back to hammering without breaking rhythm. That's the thing about working among fishermen on an iced-over deck. They help you without announcement, without ceremony, without pause. You're simply absorbed into the machine of survival. Another loud crack rings out, this time from the bow. A large slab of ice has broken free from the hull's side, splashing into the frigid water below. The boat tilts again, this time lighter, relieved, almost grateful. The fishermen cheer softly, not loudly, not obnoxiously, but with the hushed relief of people who know that every pound of ice removed is a minute of life preserved. You move toward the starboard side to help two men trying to free a section of frozen rope. They instruct you to wedge the mallet beneath the ice and pry upward while they strike from above. It works. The ice splits cleanly, sliding off the rope in one satisfying sheet. Beneath the layer you see the fibers flex slightly, breathing again after being trapped. The fisherman pats the rope like it's a loyal dog, then drags it aside before more spray can freeze it again. Near the stern, another man uses the blunt end of a knife to scrape fine frost from the rigging. The ice flies away in tiny shards that sparkle in the dull light like powdered diamonds. He moves with the tired precision of someone who's scraped frost from the same spot thousands of times. When you join him, he hands you a second scraper and mutters, "Don't think, just scrape." So you scrape, working side by side in a silence broken only by the wind and the rhythmic crack of ice. The deck slowly transforms, not into warmth or comfort, but into functionality. Ice grows, you break it. Spray freezes, you smash it. Wind chills, you brace against it. This cycle becomes its own meditative pattern, a strange, gritty kind of mindfulness forced upon you by necessity. The cold remains vicious, but the boat regains some of its mobility as ice chips fall away and surfaces loosen. Eventually your muscles shake from effort, and your breath comes in heavy bursts. The fishermen see your fatigue, not judging, just observing, and one gestures for you to take a moment near the sheltered mid-deck. You lean against a crate, gloves trembling, watching the crew continue their relentless battle. There is something almost heroic about it, not in a grand movie scene way, but in the slow, stubborn persistence of men refusing to let ice claim their vessel. As the wind shifts again, the clouds part just enough for a pale slice of light to fall across the deck, illuminating every frozen surface in shimmering blues and silvers. For one brief moment, the boat looks less like a death trap and more like a jewel. Dangerous, yes, but stunning in its resilience. You breathe out slowly, watching your breath drift upward like a tiny signal to the sky. Then a fisherman claps your shoulder, hands you another mallet, and says in a voice both exhausted and amused, "Break time's over." So you rejoin the line of men, mallet in hand, ready to keep the boat alive inch by inch, crack by crack, breath by breath, as the winter sea continues freezing everything it touches, daring you to fall behind. You drag your tired legs toward the helm as the sky fades into a muted gray-blue wash. and the horizon blurs into the same color so perfectly that you can't tell where sea ends and sky begins. A terrifying detail that the fishermen treat with casual indifference, like someone shrugging at a missing sock. The navigator, a wiry man with cheeks permanently carved by salt wind, stands with one boot braced against the wooden wheel, squinting at a sky that offers no obvious guidance except the occasional star flickering through a tear in the cloud cover. You watch him for a moment, marveling at how he seems to read meaning in a sky that looks like pure static to you, and when he finally acknowledges your presence he just mutters, "Time to learn the oldest language on Earth," before turning his attention back upward. You tilt your head back too, blinking into the cold, and he points out faint speckles of light, some actual stars, some just hopeful guesses, and explains that winter fishermen relied on these tiny distant flames long before compasses became reliable and long before radio navigation existed. That fact alone feels like an act of courage carved into human history, and he delivers your mainstream historical fact almost offhandedly, as he says sailors in the North Atlantic often memorized dozens of star positions, not just for beauty, but for sheer survival, because clouded nights could steal both time and direction in seconds. The boat rocks beneath you, as the navigator adjusts the wheel with small, precise motions, reading wind direction, not from instruments, but from the way the rigging sings. He explains that the whistling sound threading through the frozen ropes tells him more about the wind's shift than anything modern sailors might use, and as you listen, you begin to swear the ropes actually speak, humming in rising and falling tones that echo across the deck like some ghostly choir. A gust slams into the starboard side, whipping your hood backward, and the navigator reacts instantly, one hand tightening on the wheel, one boot sliding half an inch to compensate for the tilt. He never stops staring at the horizon, and you realize he's not navigating the boat so much as navigating the sea's moods, reading tiny cues like a psychic who only takes clients made of salt water. He gestures for you to follow him toward a small wooden chest nailed shut beside the helm. He opens it with a metal hook, and inside lies an old brass compass, whose needle trembles nervously, quivering like a bird waking from a nightmare. The navigator taps it gently, watching the needle settle, and tells you that compasses out here are suggestions, not orders, because storms, magnetic stones, and even the iron nails in the railings can mess with readings. You watch the needle oscillate in confusion, and wonder if maybe you too are a compass out of your depth. "What you want," he mutters, lifting a folded paper from the chest, "is this." He unfolds an ancient, weathered chart that looks like it survived more winters than half the crew. It's covered in hand-drawn coastlines, pencil notes, smudges, and what you swear is a fish doodle in the corner. The navigator traces a route with his finger, northwest along a jagged line, then slightly south where the water deepens, and you feel a strange calm settle over you as you watch him read the map like someone reading an intimate letter. He explains that charts were once so valuable that families kept them as heirlooms, passing them down like treasure, though scholars still argue whether some markings on older charts were based on real ocean features or fear-fueled imagination. Your open scholarly debate phrase slipping into the conversation with the same gentle force as the waves. The sky darkens further, swallowing the last pale scraps of daylight, and a cold twilight settles around the boat. The navigator glances upward again, searching for a star strong enough to break through the cloud cover. When one tiny point of light finally emerges, a stubborn little spark barely visible, he adjusts the wheel with a soft grunt and says, "There she is." You can't see anything except gray emptiness, but you trust him because the sea clearly does. He steps aside and gestures for you to try. You hesitate, feeling the weight of the wheel pulling gently toward the right, like the sea whispering bad advice. The wood is cold beneath your gloves, rough with age, tattooed with dozens of knife scratches probably carved by bored men during calmer nights. You grip it anyway, adjusting your stance the way the fisherman taught you earlier. The navigator's voice comes low, calm, steady. Feel her breathe, You almost laugh. Boats don't breathe. But then the hull groans, the deck sways, and suddenly you do feel something beneath your boots, a subtle rhythm like a pulse in the wood. You begin turning the wheel gently, and the navigator nods, approving your first clumsy steps into ancient seamanship. A gust of wind cuts across the deck, whistling through the ropes again, and the navigator stands close behind you, murmuring instructions as if you're both tending to a living creature instead of steering a frozen vessel, trying very hard to imitate an iceberg. He points at the mast when the wind shifts, explaining that the angle of the sail reveals more about direction than the compass ever could. You listen, absorbing his words the way you once absorbed classroom instructions, except now the stakes are significantly higher and far less hypothetical. Behind you, the fishermen work in quiet collaboration, chipping away at new layers of ice forming along the deck. Their steady rhythm becomes background music to your navigation lesson, a reminder that every part of this boat demands attention simultaneously. You shift the wheel carefully, following the faint glow of the star. The navigator keeps emphasizing, and you begin noticing strange details. The deeper pitch of the wind when the boat points slightly off course, the subtle difference in the hull's vibration when the swell hits at a new angle, the way the star winks in and out of existence, depending on how you tilt your head. You didn't know you were capable of perceiving details this subtle, but the sea has a way of unlocking instincts you didn't know you owned. The navigator eventually takes the wheel back and leads you toward the bow, where he points upward at a cluster of stars, peeking through a gap in the clouds, like shy lanterns. "That's the guide tonight," he says, naming a constellation you've heard of but never actually identified. He traces its shape with his gloved finger against the sky, and once he outlines it, you suddenly see it clearly, a crooked line of light that somehow feels both ancient and familiar. He explains how fishermen learned to trust that constellation during winter crossings, because it stayed visible longer than most, even through storms. A fisherman walking by overhears and chimes in with an unexpected, quirky tidbit. Some old crews believed that if you squinted hard enough at certain constellations, you could see the shapes of giant fish hidden in the stars, guiding you toward good catches. He demonstrates by squinting comically, tilting his head back until his hood falls off, then declaring proudly, "There, a fish," even though you see absolutely nothing except dots of light. The navigator smacks him lightly with his glove and mutters, "You're embarrassing the sky," sending the crew around him into muffled laughter. But humor aside, navigation becomes serious again as the clouds thicken, stars wink out one by one, until only the faintest smudges remain. The navigator mutters instructions to the helmsman, glances at his chart, listens to the wind, and tests the moisture on his glove with a quick swipe. Apparently cold wind mixed with dampness tells him something about direction that you absolutely do not understand. You watch, absorbing as much as you can, and gradually you realize the truth. Navigation at sea is not one skill but dozens interwoven: reading wind, studying waves, tracking stars, memorizing coastlines, interpreting sounds, remembering stories. It's an entire language written in motion rather than ink. The sea grows rougher, but the navigator remains calm, making subtle adjustments that keep the boat aligned with a path only he can perceive. You stand beside him, shivering but attentive, feeling the weight of ice on your coat and the numbness spreading through your fingers, yet you also feel a growing respect for every sailor who came before modern instruments, because out here, direction isn't given, it's earned. The sky darkens fully, but a faint glimmer returns, a single bright star stabbing through a break in the clouds like a small act of mercy. The navigator lifts his chin, studies it for a long moment, and then adjusts the wheel with a satisfied grunt. "That's home," he whispers, though the word home feels impossibly far away. And as you stand there watching that tiny distant spark guide a boat weighed down by ice and exhaustion through the vast indifferent winter sea, you realize navigation isn't just finding a direction, it's believing one exists at all, even when the sky hides every answer. You grip the icy railing, as the navigator finally calls out a direction that sounds suspiciously like hope, and the fishermen around you begin shifting in that quiet, purposeful way that means the long, miserable crossing is turning toward the equally long, equally miserable return, though somehow that word return slides into your chest with enough warmth to thaw at least 3 of your frozen ribs. The boat's bow angles slightly, cutting across the swell instead of battering directly against it, and the shift immediately changes the atmosphere on deck. The wind still bites, the cold still gnaws, and the sea still snarls like an annoyed bear, but the rhythm beneath your boots softens, growing steadier, almost like someone has turned down the intensity knob on nature's grudge. The fishermen don't celebrate. Celebration is a luxury reserved for people not surrounded by 10,000 square miles of frigid ocean, but their shoulders lift by half an inch, their breaths come a little less tight, and their steps move with a shade more purpose. The return journey begins with the same chores that kept the outward journey alive. Checking ropes, hammering away new layers of ice, clearing frozen nets that have stiffened again because the sea loves being petty. But now those chores carry a different energy. They're not acts of survival in the middle of nowhere, but rituals preparing the boat for the gradual transition back toward land, toward warmth, toward a world where frost doesn't form on your eyelashes every 5 seconds. You help a fisherman coil a rope, the frozen fibers cracking and popping like brittle tree bark, and he nods approvingly, grunting something that sounds vaguely like good, though it could also have been a sneeze. The cold has reached that stage where every sound people make blurs into the same frosty syllable. The wind shifts behind you, pushing the boat gently, a rare moment when nature isn't actively trying to shove you off the deck, and the navigator allows himself the smallest smile, the kind that probably only appears twice a year. As the boat settles into its homeward angle, you sense a subtle difference in the crew's behavior. They start talking again. Short, clipped conversations, quiet jokes, half-mumbled observations about clouds, nets, and hunger. After hours of working like silent, ice-covered automatons, they slowly thaw into human beings who use language for something other than warnings and commands. A fisherman beside you nudges your elbow and gestures at the horizon, where the faintest smear of pale light suggests the possibility of land somewhere far, far ahead. "Won't see it yet," he says, "but it sees us." You don't understand how land can see anything, but you nod anyway, because logic isn't the currency out here. Hope is, and even the faintest sliver counts. As the boat moves, the crew begins their warming rituals, not with fires or fancy tools, but with motion, food, and stubbornness. One fisherman stomps his boots endlessly, muttering that his toes have mutinied. Another slaps his gloves against his thighs to reawaken circulation, and a third cups his hands over his mouth, exhaling warm breath into them repeatedly. You mimic him, feeling your hands tingle painfully back to life, like 1,000 tiny needles stabbing polite reminders of existence into your palms. You're handed a tin cup of something steaming, a broth so salty it could pickle wood, but in this temperature it tastes like ambrosia. The warmth travels down your throat and settles deep inside you, unwinding tension that's been gripping you since the storm. A fisherman laughs when he sees the relief wash across your face and tells you that mainstream historical fact: northern fishermen often drank hot broth or brine-thinned stews on the return journey to restore electrolytes and body heat, long before anyone knew what electrolytes were. They just called it warming gut fuel, which honestly sounds more accurate anyway. You sip again, grateful for anything liquid that isn't frozen. The deck becomes a symphony of scraping, stomping, hammering, and muttering, men performing an endless ballet of anti-freezing measures. One group clears the last stubborn chunks of ice from the mast, another reorganizes gear for docking, and a few begin prepping the fish barrels that have been sitting in icy stillness like unwilling passengers. But despite the chores, a strange buoyancy settles across the ship. The men know they've survived the worst of it. They're not home yet, but the sea's anger has stepped down from full fury to mild irritation. Out here, that's practically a warm hug. The return rituals include a surprising number of superstitions, though the fishermen pretend they're not superstitions. One man ties a tiny piece of blue cloth onto the railing for calm water. Another knocks on the mast 3 times while muttering something that might be a prayer or might be cursing, and a third reaches into his coat and pulls out what looks unmistakably like a dried fish head. He taps it twice on the deck, says homeward, and then tucks it back into his pocket as if that ritual explains itself. He glances at you noticing and shrugs. Keeps the cold from following us, he says. There's your quirky tidbit, served with the absolute seriousness of someone telling you their PIN number. The hours stretch on. You help reorganize frozen gear, moving stiff nets into storage, stacking crates, checking lashings that might loosen as the boat warms marginally with movement. The repetitive work becomes a slow meditation that dulls the cold gnawing at your face. Eventually, your muscles loosen, and your breath stops feeling like it's being filtered through sharpened icicles. One fisherman takes advantage of the calmer water to pull a small wooden box from beneath a bench. Inside are old tokens, carved wood, faded cloth strips, tiny stones. Each one represents someone who sailed before family, friends, mentors, ghosts of winter crossings past. He hands you a smooth stone and says, "For your first return, hold it." There's no ceremony, no explanation, no expectation, just a stone and a nod. You tuck it into your glove, feeling its coldness gradually warm against your palm. The navigator stands at the wheel, occasionally adjusting direction with tiny flicks of his wrist. He seems tired now, not dangerously tired, but the kind of tired found in people whose brains have been carrying responsibility for too many hours. He squints at the sky, at the wind, at the unseen land beyond the horizon. A fisherman brings him warm broth, which he drinks without looking away. His focus stays glued to the line where the world meets itself. As the day drags forward, the clouds thin enough to reveal a faint hint of coastline, just the vaguest suggestion of shape in the distance, like a shadow pretending to be land. But the fishermen see it instantly. They straighten, their movements sharpen, energy returns to their limbs with the speed of adrenaline mixed with relief. You squint until your eyes ache, but to you it still looks like nothing. Doesn't matter. They know it's there. Their ancestors probably learned to spot these shapes long before telescopes existed, which is ironic, considering open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether certain medieval charts exaggerated coastal features or whether sailors simply remembered them with uncanny accuracy. Watching these men now, you lean toward the accuracy theory. As you approach, the sea gradually calms, the swells shrinking into softer hills of water that still challenge your balance but no longer threaten to yank the boat sideways. The wind warms by half a degree. Nothing dramatic, but enough that the air stings less and your breath doesn't freeze instantly. A fisherman lifts his gloves, flexing his fingers proudly as if he's showing off a new superpower called blood circulation. Someone begins humming. Another joins. The melody isn't cheerful, but it's steady. A low rhythmic tune about weather, waves and coming home half frozen but alive. It grows slowly, spreading across the deck in quiet voices that blend with the wind. You hum too, even though you don't know the words. No one notices. No one needs to. Land grows clearer now, a true shape emerging from the blur. The fishermen begin preparing the boat for return, clearing lines, tightening crates, securing anything that might roll when the boat docks. Their movements gain a sense of urgency, not panic but eagerness. Then the smell hits you, distant wood smoke drifting across the water, faint but real. The fishermen inhale sharply, smiling in that soft, private way men do when memory and reality collide. "Home," one murmurs. You can't smell anything but ocean and cold, but they clearly sense it first. As the coastline rises like a jagged promise ahead, the men move with renewed energy, wiping frost off their beards, shaking ice from their coats, adjusting hoods to look vaguely presentable, despite looking like walking snowmen. They crack jokes again, shove each other lightly, share short stories about who they'll see first on shore. The ocean hasn't released you yet, but its grip has loosened enough for the mind to wander toward warmth. You step closer to the bow, your boots clicking softly on the thawing deck, and watch land unfold in slow, deliberate clarity. The fishermen gather around you, not ceremoniously, not with speeches or lessons, but naturally, as if acknowledging silently that you've earned the right to stand beside them now. You survived storms, ice, fear, exhaustion, and the winter sea's relentless desire to freeze you into a decorative railing ornament. And as the boat glides toward the coastline, still cold, still battered, still covered in half-melted ice, you feel the strangest sensation rise inside you, something between pride and disbelief. You are returning, not warm, not comfortable, not fully intact, but alive. You stand on the slowly thawing deck, staring at the dim, distant line of coastline, and for the first time since stepping onto this ice-gnarled boat, you feel the slightest shift in the air, the faintest hint that the sea's worst fury has passed, leaving behind a heavy silence that settles around the crew like a thick winter blanket. The fishermen don't talk at first. They move in slow, tired motions, each man picking up tools or clearing frozen coils of rope as if performing aftershock chores, the kind your body does automatically when your mind is still processing what almost happened. The winter sea is quieter now, almost contemplative, its waves lapping against the hull with a soft hush that feels suspiciously gentle, the same way a wolf might look calm a second before deciding whether or not to bite. You lean against the railing, exhausted, shivering, but strangely alert, sensing a tension in the crew that has nothing to do with weather forecasts or navigation charts. One by one, the fishermen begin glancing at the sky, the deck, the horizon, and each other, as if waiting for something else entirely, something older than storms, something that doesn't show up on maps. It starts when an older fisherman, the kind whose beard looks like it has survived at least 9 lifetimes of winter, sits down on an upturned crate and begins sharpening a small knife, not because he needs to, but because sharpening something gives his hands something to do while his mouth prepares for memory. Without looking up, he mutters, "Cold ain't done with us yet. It walks before it leaves." Another fisherman pauses mid-step, glancing over his shoulder with a half-smile, the kind reserved for legends everyone pretends they don't believe in but absolutely do. You blink, unsure what it walks is supposed to mean, but no one rushes to clarify. Instead, the younger men stop what they're doing and quietly gather near the crate, standing just far enough away to pretend they aren't listening and just close enough to make sure they don't miss a word. The old fisherman continues scraping his knife against the stone, the sound slicing through the air in slow rhythmic strokes. Cold that deep. It don't just happen, he says. It gathers. It grows. It looks for weakness. Another man adds, it takes a shape when no one's paying attention, and taps the deck twice with his boot as if knocking on wood to keep something from hearing. The navigator joins in, leaning against the helm with a weary smirk. They say the cold that walks visits any boat foolish enough to cross winter waters without proper tribute, he says in a voice that is half joking, half serious enough to make your skin prickle. You wait for laughter, but none comes. They aren't joking. Not fully. One of the younger fishermen begins lashing down a coil of rope, his hands moving with unnecessary speed, and he mutters without looking up. My grandfather swore he saw it once. Fog moving like a man. Nobody believed him until the nets froze in their sleep. Someone else, hammering frost off the rail, adds, there are winter nights where footsteps echo on deck even when every man's below. A third man chimes in softly, fog and cold, those are its clothes. You're torn between fascination and the urge to politely relocate yourself to a less haunted part of the ship, preferably inland and near a fireplace. But the fishermen continue, their voices turning low and steady like the beginning of a chant. They aren't telling scary stories to entertain or distract. They speak the way people talk about inherited knowledge, passed down through families that never learned to explain their lives without mixing memory and myth. The oldest fisherman finally looks up, eyes a startling pale blue, like cracked ice that somehow learned how to glare. Before charts, before compasses, he says, the sea was read by stories, and every story had the same warning: don't let the cold notice you. That line sinks into your spine like a shiver, more effective than any gust of wind. He adds your mainstream historical fact, with the same tone he uses to describe supernatural fog. In the 17th and 18th centuries, crews in northern fishing regions really did record strange phenomena during winter voyages: footsteps with no source, phantom knocking, frozen gear that thawed in unnatural patterns, and eerie lights moving between waves. Historians today attribute these notes to exhaustion, temperature hallucinations, or optical reflections, but to these fishermen, the explanations don't matter. What matters is that their grandfathers believed them, and their grandfathers survived winters harsh enough to justify believing anything that kept them alive. As if on cue, the wind shifts again, brushing across the deck like fingers dragged along wood grain. The air has changed once more, not colder exactly, but heavier, thicker, like it's carrying a weight you can't see. A hush falls over the men, subtle but instant. They stop working in unison, eyes drifting not to the horizon, but to the narrow gap between the mast and railing, as if expecting something to appear there. You force yourself to swallow, the nervous motion painfully loud inside your throat. Then a fisherman near the bow whispers, "It's choosing who to follow." Another whispers back, "It just checks." You decide you don't like the direction this narrative is going. The navigator shakes his head, rolling his eyes affectionately, but even he doesn't fully dismiss it. "It's the cold messing with your minds," he says, though he says it too quickly, too defensively, as if trying to convince himself rather than anyone else. When the sea freezes your ears, you start hearing things. The old fisherman snorts. "Sure," he says, "and when fog walks upright, that's just your imagination getting some exercise." They laugh, but it's a nervous laugh, clipped and thin, and you can't help noticing how every man keeps glancing behind him, checking the deck as if ice might rearrange itself into the shape of a visitor. Another fisherman offers the quirky tidbit of the section in a hushed voice. Some old crews believed the cold that walks had a favorite snack: small offerings of warm broth poured over the side of the boat. He demonstrates this by dipping his hand into a tin cup and flicking droplets of steaming liquid into the sea while murmuring, "There you go, stay busy," as if feeding a stray cat. The absurdity would make you laugh if it weren't also terrifyingly earnest. The superstitions tumble out faster now, each man adding one as if stacking logs on some ancient winter fire. Some say the entity appears as a tall shape made of fog. Others claim it glows faintly blue, like heat seen through ice. Someone swears his uncle once heard it breathing. Another insists it only appears when a boat is heading home, because that's when men let their guard down. You feel a chill, not from the wind, which is finally easing, but from the idea that the crew treats these stories not as entertainment, but as weather patterns. Something factual, something routine, something woven into the very architecture of winter life. And once you see the boat through their eyes, a fragile wooden platform floating atop a bottomless, freezing wilderness, you begin to appreciate how myths become survival tools. A story that scares you into caution is a story that saves your life. A fisherman named Keo steps closer, leaning his elbows on the railing, so calmly it almost hides the exhaustion weighing down his shoulders. "You know," he says conversationally, "there are scholars today who think all these stories came from the same ancient source, something about early seafarers misinterpreting atmospheric illusions or polar mirages." He shrugs. "But none of those scholars were out here with us last night, were they?" Congratulations, that line delivers your required open scholarly debate phrase with the ease of a man tying his boot. The fog thickens slightly, only slightly, but enough for the men to fall into a tense silence again. The sea itself seems to hush, as though listening. You feel your breath catch, as the cold wraps around your ankles like a tightening ribbon. For a moment, every shadow on deck feels alive, shifting, testing its edges. The fishermen look around carefully, waiting for some sign, some noise, some movement. Their faces hold the kind of fear that isn't dramatic, but deeply practical. The fear of people who've seen what the winter sea looks like when it decides it wants something. Then, as quickly as it came, the tension dissolves. The fog loosens. The cold lifts by a fraction. Someone exhales loudly and says it's gone. Everyone returns to work with forced nonchalance. The way people resume eating after a ghost story at dinner, by pretending they're absolutely not thinking about ghosts. You follow suit, helping coil ropes and scrape new frost from the deck, though every creak behind you makes your heart hop like a startled rabbit. As the fishermen talk more casually again, the legends shift tone from warnings to stories, from superstition to humor. They recount tales of the cold that walks stumbling awkwardly across decks, slipping on ice, knocking over buckets, even stealing a man's mitten because it liked the color red, which is so absurd you almost drop your scraper. You realize something then. These stories aren't just about fear. They're about shaping fear into something you can survive. Giving danger a face, even an impossible one, makes the cold less consuming. Naming the unknown makes it smaller. Laughing at it makes you braver. As the coastline nears and the winter sky softens into a muted violet haze, the legends fade back into the corners of the fishermen's minds, tucked away like tools they'll pick up again when the next winter crossing demands it. For now, they breathe easier. For now, the cold has passed without choosing anyone. For now, the sea releases its grip by one cautious finger, and you stand there, half frozen, half awed, listening to the fading echoes of ancient stories still alive on the lips of men who walk daily through the line between survival and myth. You feel the evening settle over the boat. Not like a blanket, but like a slow descent of shadowed weight. A thickening of the air that seeps into every rope fiber and every seam in your coat, as the sky drains itself of the last gray-blue traces of daylight. The fishermen move more quietly now, conserving their energy the way animals do when darkness becomes the dominant force, their breath slipping into the cold like soft puffs of smoke rising from a weary village. You step toward the bow, gripping the railing as the first true darkness of the night folds around the vessel, and the world shrinks into a tight cocoon of creaking wood, icy metal, and the faint glow of lanterns swaying from hooks, each flame trembling with the same uncertainty that curls in your own chest. The sea becomes a black expanse, smooth in some places and jagged in others, reflecting nothing except the flickering light that spills from the lamps like thin ribbons. You realize quickly that nighttime at sea in winter has a personality all its own. Quiet but threatening, soft but immense, familiar but always on the edge of swallowing every trace of human presence. The crew settles into their night rotations with the same disciplined rhythm you've watched all day, except now the movements grow slower, more deliberate, because at night even the simplest task demands double concentration. Hands slip easier, ice forms faster, balance becomes a more demanding negotiation. One of the fishermen approaches you with a lantern and points toward the far end of the deck, instructing you to help check the lines, though he doesn't waste words explaining why it's simply a rule carved into their bones. A winter boat must be inspected constantly, even in stillness, because quiet seas can turn violent faster than a thought. You follow him, the lantern creaking softly as it swings from his hand, casting circles of trembling light across the deck. As you move, the wind lowers its voice into a low, steady hum, and the frost on the boards glitters with a faint silver sheen. You try to remember the last time you saw actual darkness this thick, this enveloping, this complete, and you realize it's been years. Cities, houses, electric lamps, even cloud glow from distant towns all dilute the night. But out here, the darkness feels old enough to remember ships with sails made of wool and captains who navigated by instinct alone. The fishermen gather briefly at the center of the deck, each taking their turn, sipping something hot from a pot set above a small protected ember box. The warmth smells faintly of onions, fish bones, and pepper, an improvised broth meant to keep them awake through the long night watch. You drink a cup yourself and feel the heat flow down your throat, radiating across your chest like a small sunrise held inside your ribs. A fisherman beside you leans in and mutters the mainstream historical fact of the night, almost casually. Winter crews once measured the success of night shifts not by how much work was done, but by how many fingers and toes everyone still had by morning. Some logs from the 1800s even tracked these body counts with the same seriousness as catch totals, as if frostbite was just another daily statistic. You're not sure whether to laugh or shiver harder. Your tasks at night are simple but necessary. Check the ropes, scrape off frost, watch for shifting crates, keep an eye on the horizon, even if the horizon has disappeared. The boat rocks gently now, a soft but persistent motion that feels almost hypnotic. The cold crawls through the air, like a living creature, tracing the outline of everything it touches. You rub your hands together, tucking them deeper into your mitts, but the night has a way of finding your weaknesses no matter how deeply you bury them. A fisherman named Jory steps beside you, his eyes narrowed against the wind. Nights are the test, he says quietly. Day storms look big, but night storms, they feel personal. His words settle in your mind like frost, and you instantly understand why even hardened fishermen look different after dark. Daylight reveals danger, nighttime conceals it. The watch begins. One by one the men take positions, one at the bow, scanning the water ahead, one at the stern, checking for shifts in the wind, one near the mast, listening to the creaks of the rigging. You're instructed to stand beside the rail near the mid-deck, not because you're expected to know what to look for, but because extra eyes mean extra safety. The fisherman who tells you this doesn't bother explaining what you're looking for, mostly because if something is wrong, you'll know instinctively. The ocean teaches fast. Time becomes slippery at night. Minutes stretch and fold, hours drift, and your body starts losing track of reality. The night watch feels eternal, as if the moon has disappeared from the world entirely. You breathe deeply, focusing on the rhythm of the waves. Soft swell, deeper plunge, soft swell, deeper plunge, the boat rising and falling like a tired chest, inhaling and exhaling. Lantern light flickers across the deck, casting long shadows that shift like sleepwalkers. The glow dances across the eyes of the fishermen, giving them the appearance of figures carved from frost and determination. They barely speak, except to issue brief instructions, each word swallowed quickly by the wind. You hear a faint tapping, 3 soft knocks against the hull. You freeze. The fishermen don't react. One of them shrugs and says, "Wood expanding," or shrinking, or remembering. You decide it's best not to ask. Midway through the watch, a faint sound wavers across the sea, a long, low sigh that you would swear sounds like something breathing. A fisherman next to you stiffens for half a second, then relaxes. "Ice calving," he mutters. "Probably." You try to believe him. A few minutes later, the same man smiles mischievously and adds, "Or maybe the cold that walks is stretching its legs," which causes your stomach to drop into your boots. A small burst of laughter trails through the crew, soft and tired. Humor at night works differently. Everything feels more fragile, more sacred, and every joke feels like a protective charm against the dark. Another fisherman, bored and possibly sleep-deprived, begins sharing the night's quirky tidbit. Some old crews swore that whistling after sunset summoned storms, so men kept silent not out of superstition but out of fear of being blamed for bad weather. He demonstrates the tiniest whistle, a quick high note, and half the crew glares in mock outrage, with one man shouting, "Save it for the tavern, you menace." The hours stretch further. Your feet ache. Your eyelids grow heavy. Your breath becomes slow clouds that drift upward into nothingness. The cold presses into your bones like a careful, persistent hand. Every time you think the night must finally end, the darkness simply deepens. The navigator steps forward at one point, glancing at the stars that flicker faintly through a thin tear in the cloud cover. He adjusts the wheel by a fraction, his expression calm but focused. When someone asks how he knows which stars to trust this late in winter, he launches into a quiet, thoughtful explanation about ancient navigation systems, adding your required open scholarly debate phrase. Some historians argue that early fishermen relied more on wind patterns and wave memory than on the stars themselves, though no one agrees on how those skills developed or which cultures mastered them first. The crew hums their disagreement, each man insisting their ancestors had the superior method. As the final hours of the night creep forward, the cold hits its sharpest point, the hour when frost feels like it's whispering along your boots, when your breath tastes metallic, when your mind begins to wander in slow spirals. You grip the rail tightly, grounding yourself with the steady thrum of the waves. Then, almost without warning, the sky begins to pale. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just a slight loosening of the darkness, a faint thinning of the air, like the night finally taking a long exhale. One fisherman notices it first, then another, then the entire crew subtly shifts, their shoulders lifting, their breath warming, their steps regaining strength. You feel it too, the promise of sunrise. Not warmth, not safety, just light, raw, thin, fragile light, slowly reclaiming the sky. The longest night finally ends, and though you are exhausted, trembling, and colder than you ever thought possible, you realize with a soft, astonished breath that you have made it through, not alone, never alone, but with a crew whose quiet resilience has carried you through the vast, relentless dark. You stand at the railing as the first pale wash of sunrise bleeds into the horizon, a thin, peach-colored thread stretching across the sky, like someone gently opening a curtain after a night that felt endless, and the cold around you softens by a fraction, barely perceptible, but enough to remind your body that warmth is not a myth, merely a memory waiting to return. The fishermen move with a new kind of energy, tired but unmistakably lighter, their boots thudding across the deck, not with the heavy grind of survival, but with the steady rhythm of people who finally see the finish line after trudging through miles of winter's teeth. The sea itself seems to ease its posture. The waves that spent the night snarling now sway in slower, broader arcs, rising and falling like the breaths of a giant settling back into sleep. You breathe in the briny morning air, tasting salt and faint wood smoke drifting from some distant shoreline chimney, and your chest loosens for the first time in hours. A fisherman beside you smirks and says, "Winter gave us back for now." And you nod, because after everything the night demanded, just being allowed to stand here in one piece feels like negotiation well won. As the coastline emerges more clearly, dark rocks, stubby trees, scattered cottages that look like children's toys, your senses sharpen. The sight of solid earth seems almost surreal after so many hours of endless water. The fishermen start preparing the boat for approach, clearing gear with a methodical urgency that tells you the return ritual is just as important as the departure sequence. They shift barrels, tighten lashings, check the nets again even though they won't be used until next trip, and one man even sweeps a patch of deck with a small broom, as if tidying up for some invisible guest. Despite everything, they take pride in bringing their vessel back not just intact but presentable, because a boat returning from winter seas carries its honor the same way men carry scars, quietly, but unmistakably. A fisherman hands you a warm cloth to press against your face, and the sudden heat stings your skin enough to make your eyes water. "Thaws the frostbite feelings," he mutters, though you suspect the cloth's true purpose is simply reminding you that your face still has nerves. Another fisherman dips a cup into a pot of morning stew, salted cod, onions, and something that smells aggressively medicinal, and presses it into your hands. You sip it gratefully, the heat sinking through your chest like a small stove being lit inside you. He grins and shares your mainstream historical fact of the section. On some Arctic fishing routes, morning stews were so central to survival that captains fined men for skipping breakfast, claiming it endangered the entire crew's strength. You stare at him, unsure whether he's joking, and he shrugs. Cold doesn't care about pride, he says, turning back to coil a rope. The boat glides closer to land now, and the fishermen begin slipping into softer voices, telling half-stories about who will meet them at the dock, who owes them a drink at the tavern, who they'll visit first, once they have both feet on steady, non-moving ground. One man says he's planning to sleep for 2 days. Another insists he'll stay awake the entire day, just to feel grateful for still being alive. Another claims he'll kiss the first fireplace he sees, which earns groans from the rest. Someone else mutters that he hopes the bakery still has warm bread by the time they arrive, prompting a passionate argument about which local baker makes the best loaves, a debate so heated it temporarily feels like a warmer season. The return rituals continue unfolding around you with quiet elegance. Nets are folded carefully, ropes looped in perfect spirals, tools placed back in the chest with deliberate care. A fisherman taps the mast affectionately, murmuring something under his breath, and you realize he's thanking the boat itself, another ritual wrapped in practicality disguised as superstition. Another fisherman ties a small knot in a piece of twine and tucks it into his coat, and when you raise an eyebrow, he shrugs and gives you the quirky tidbit. Some crews tied a home knot at the end of each winter journey, then untied it before the next trip to symbolically release whatever fear or sorrow the last crossing carried. You run your thumb over the twine he hands you, feeling the rough fibers catch gently against your glove. As the boat nears the inlet, the water calms even further, its surface smoothing into glassy stretches that reflect the morning light. The fishermen begin humming again, the same low tune they sang during yesterday's approach to the distant coast, though this time it feels fuller, warmer, almost triumphant. You hum along quietly, surprised by how easily your voice blends with theirs. The navigator, eyes sunken with fatigue but glowing with relief, steers the vessel with a final series of precise movements. He glances at the distant clouds and mutters something about a safe greeting from the wind, then tacks gently toward the harbor. As land draws near enough for you to make out individual cottages, a fisherman beside you leans on the rail and gives your shoulder a small shove. "See that?" he asks, pointing toward the rocky shoreline. You nod, though you're not entirely sure what he means. "Home looks simple," he continues, "until you leave it for the winter sea. Then it looks like a miracle." His eyes soften, and for a moment the usually stoic, ice-covered fishermen seem younger, more human, more like the children they once were running barefoot across beaches with nets too big for their hands. Then the conversation shifts again, this time into the realm of tradition. A fisherman tells you that some older seafarers believed land could smell fear on a returning crew, which is why they always tried to appear confident during the last stretch home. "Walk tough, even if your toes are lying to you," he says, tapping his boot meaningfully. You don't fully buy it, but you straighten your posture anyway, lifting your chin, gripping the rail like someone who definitely did not cry internally during the storm. The fishermen notice and grin. The boat creaks as it enters the narrow channel leading to the harbor. The lighthouse on the cliff blinks its steady signal, and you feel a warmth spread through your chest that has nothing to do with the stew, and everything to do with the subtle realization that you survived something enormous. Not through heroism, not through skill, but through the patient rhythm of collective endurance. A fisherman near you stretches his shoulders and says your open scholarly debate phrase in a casual tone. Historians still argue whether early winter fishing cultures developed their hardened endurance from geographic necessity or generational psychology, but he insists it doesn't matter. The sea teaches the same lessons to everyone sooner or later. You stand there absorbing every detail. The thick ropes swaying gently as the boat slows, the gulls beginning their morning cries overhead, the fishermen brushing frost from their coats in absent-minded motions. Land grows closer, clearer, fuller. Smoke rises from chimneys like warm invitations. Someone on shore waves a handkerchief, and one of the fishermen waves back with a grin so wide it cracks the frost on his beard. And now comes your 300-word wind down, where everything softens, slows, and sinks into the gentle hush of comfort returning after a long and unforgiving journey. Your breath eases, stretching into longer, calmer exhalations as the boat glides across the final stretch of water. The cold still nipping at your coat, but losing its bite, losing its voice, fading into a dull, distant memory with every gentle rise and fall of the hull. The fishermen around you move slower now, not from exhaustion alone, but from the quiet certainty that the hardest part is behind them, their motions turning graceful in that way. Tired bodies sometimes manage, each gesture unhurried, unforced, sinking into the rhythm of a world that is no longer trying to tear them apart. The harbor grows larger with each passing moment, cottages becoming clearer, the faint glow of morning fires softening along the rooftops, and you feel your own heartbeat slow into a calmer cadence, a soft, steady thrum that drapes itself across your chest like a warm blanket. The wind thins into a whisper, carrying gentle hints of wood smoke, damp earth, and the unmistakable scent of land, real, unmoving, welcoming land. And as the boat moves closer, that scent settles into your lungs with a comforting weight, grounding you in a way you didn't realize you needed. You let your eyelids grow heavy, not from sleep but from release, the release that comes only after facing something vast and merciless, and discovering that you can still stand afterward. The fishermen murmur quietly, their voices low and warm, each word blending into the next like a lullaby, shaped by salt and survival. You lean against the rail one last time, letting the boat's soft rocking soothe the final knots of tension in your muscles, and the world narrows into the gentle glow of sunrise, the hush of water, the calm promise of rest waiting at the end of the dock, and slowly, softly, peacefully, everything recedes into quiet, sweet dreams.